Hi there, and welcome to Outlaw Icons, where history whispers in the dark. Tonight, we invite you to step into the shadowed world of Aniello Dellacroce, the man they called the Silent Monk. Feared, revered, unshakably loyal. Dellacroce wasn't just the underboss of the Gambino family. He was its quiet, beating heart, the ghost in the corner, the watchful eye behind every move. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it right now? We love watching this little underworld grow across countries and time zones. Now, take a deep breath, let the chaos of the day fade into silence, and prepare to disappear into the life and legend of a man whose silence was more terrifying than any shout. This is Outlaw Icons, your sleepy dawn. Chapter 1. Born into the Shadows. They said he never blinked. Not when a man screamed. Not when a friend betrayed him. Not even when a body dropped at his feet. In the underworld of the Mafia, where fear was currency and silence was law, Aniello Dellacroce learned early that blinking, hesitation, was the beginning of weakness. And weakness, in East Harlem during the Prohibition years, could cost a boy his life before he ever learned how to be a man. But long before they called him the Silent Monk, long before he stood in the shadows behind the Gambino throne, Aniello was just another boy on the corner, small, sharp-eyed, and always watching. He was born in the spring of 1914, into a city already humming with danger. The streets of East Harlem were tight with noise, stifling heat, and the smell of iron and smoke. Immigrants poured in from Italy, carrying nothing but calloused hands, old country pride, and children who would have to learn how to survive faster than they could learn English. Aniello's family lived on East 116th Street. The tenement building leaned inward like it was tired from holding up too many dreams. His father, Francesco, worked long hours as a plasterer, his hands always caked in dry dust, his back bent like a question mark. His mother, Antoinette, watched over the home with a quiet that Aniello would one day perfect into an art. They were not poor in spirit, but money was always a whisper away from vanishing. The neighborhood boys played stickball in the alley, but Aniello wasn't one for games. Not for long. He watched older kids slip into back doors of pool halls where cigar smoke coiled through cracked windows. He saw men with clean shoes and sharper eyes press folded bills into trembling hands. And when his uncle got arrested for bootlegging, Aniello didn't ask why. He simply listened. That's what he did best. He listened. Even as a boy, there was something unnatural about his stillness. Other kids ran. Aniello waited. By the time he was 12, he'd already been caught shoplifting from a fruit stand. He didn't flinch when the owner grabbed him by the collar. When the cop arrived, Aniello said nothing. Not one word. He didn't cry. He didn't plead. He just stared ahead, hollow-eyed, as if the whole thing was a misunderstanding he was already done with. The officer let him go with a warning, but it stuck with him. This kid didn't talk. He didn't need to. As Prohibition roared through the 20s, East Harlem turned into a pipeline for illegal booze and blood. Men like Lucky Luciano and Vito Genovese ran liquor down the avenues like veins under the city's skin. And in the cracks between their empires, boys like Aniello grew up learning the rules that no school could teach. Loyalty was everything. Silence was survival. And violence was always just around the corner, waiting. He got into his first real fight at 15. A local tough named Marco tried to shake down a corner vendor, an old man who had given Aniello free oranges during lean weeks. Marco shoved him, laughed, called him names no man should say in front of another's mother. Aniello didn't hesitate. He grabbed a broken broomstick and swung. It wasn't clean. It wasn't heroic. But when it was over, Marco was crawling, and the old man didn't say thank you. He just nodded once, slowly, the way men in that world gave praise without using words. From that day on, the whispers began. They said he didn't feel fear. They said he had dead eyes. They said he was born in the dark. The truth was simpler. He just hated waste. Wasted movement. Wasted breath. Wasted loyalty. He dropped out of school at 16. Started running errands for small-time racketeers. Carrying number slips, collecting debts, relaying messages between men who didn't trust telephones. He never spoke more than he had to. One bookmaker said Aniello was like a ghost. You'd turn around and he was there, quiet, calm, cold as a butcher's table, but always respectful. That was important. Respect. Even the ones who feared him most never called him rude. There was something surgical about the way he moved through the city. He studied the people around him like a man reading a map, memorizing each crack in the pavement. He was never the loudest, never the biggest, but people began stepping aside for him without thinking. That kind of space doesn't come from muscle. It comes from presence. By 17, he was making collections for a soldier in the Mangano family, one of the 5 families of New York's Cosa Nostra. He didn't even know the man's name at first. They only called him Zio, uncle, a sharp-dressed, slow-speaking mafioso who taught Aniello one of his most lasting lessons. Don't raise your voice, he told him once, after a debtor argued about interest. Raise your eyebrows. Let a man imagine what you'll do. His imagination will do worse than your fists ever could. Aniello never forgot that. He began to hone that style like a blade. Precision over panic. Stillness over noise. He became known for showing up on time, never talking too much, and always following orders exactly. In a world full of chaos, Aniello was a man who brought order. But there were darker corners too. The streets were flooded with young men desperate for work, and some found it in blood. Some boys vanished. Some were found in the East River with their hands tied behind their backs. And through it all, Aniello's name began showing up in whispered rumors, but never in headlines. Never on paper. It wasn't that he was invisible. It was that he was untouchable. The police files from that era are thin. A few arrests, a few detentions, but nothing that stuck. No fingerprints on weapons. No testimony. No one willing to say his name out loud in a courtroom. And maybe that was the most terrifying thing about him. He didn't need to be loud. His silence made others speak for him. There was a story that circulated in Little Italy during the early 30s. A man, a small-time thief, had stolen from a truck protected by the Mangano crew. Not a major job, just a few crates. But word got back to Zio, and Zio sent Aniello. No one knows exactly what happened. All that's certain is that the thief left town the next morning with a broken nose, a limp, and a look in his eyes like he'd seen something that couldn't be explained. He never came back. No one asked why. Aniello was only 19. He still lived with his parents. Still ate dinner with his mother when he could. Still walked his little sister to church on Sundays. And yet, beneath that quiet, familial rhythm, another rhythm pulsed. One of power, fear, and something even deeper, belief. He believed in the life. Not the glamour. Not the wealth. But the discipline. The hierarchy. The unspoken brotherhood of men who didn't need to advertise who they were. In the coming years, he would rise. He would earn. He would kill. But in 1933, as Prohibition drew to a close and the American Mafia began transforming into something bigger, darker, more structured, Aniello Dellacroce was still just a young man in the shadows. The streets had raised him. The code had shaped him. And now, men were beginning to notice the boy with the dead eyes who never blinked. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly predict, was that this quiet figure from East Harlem would one day become the gatekeeper of the most powerful crime family in America. And when the gate finally opened, the blood would run for decades. But before he could rule in silence, he would first have to survive the noise. And the noise was coming. Chapter 2. Baptized by Violence. The boy was just 16 when the blood first stained his hands. Real blood, not the scraped-up kind from alley brawls or busted knuckles on brick walls. This was blood that spilled too fast, too dark, and it changed him. It wasn't a moment of rage. It was calculated, cold, a warning delivered on behalf of someone older, someone connected. And the moment it happened, Aniello Dellacroce wasn't just another kid from the Lower East Side. He was something else now, something feared. New York in the 1930s was a city of smoke and silence. The Great Depression had carved out the marrow of hope for most, but the underworld thrived in the cracks. The Mafia wasn't some whisper in the shadows. It was becoming a shadow all its own, stretching over the docks, the unions, the streets, the cops. And young Aniello, sharp-eyed and tight-lipped, moved through that world like a ghost in a church. Never loud, never foolish, but always watching. They called him quiet even then. Not just quiet, still. Like something waiting. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, but when he did, the words were like glass, precise, sharp, and impossible to ignore. In a neighborhood bursting with mouths too quick to move and fists too eager to swing, Dellacroce stood out not because he made noise, but because he didn't. He earned his first bones on the streets around First Avenue. Numbers running, dice games, muscle work. But where other kids got off on the chaos, the thrill of flashing a switchblade or cracking someone's jaw for late payment, Aniello seemed detached. Not cruel, just indifferent. Like pain didn't move him. Like he'd already made peace with what this life would cost. It wasn't long before the right people started noticing. Albert Anastasia, the high priest of violence himself, saw something in Aniello. Maybe it was the discipline. Maybe it was the eerie calm in his eyes when things went sideways. But most likely, it was because Dellacroce didn't flinch. Ever. And in a world where loyalty was bought with blood and power was enforced with fear, that kind of nerve was worth more than gold. Anastasia brought him in closer, but it was through the Mangano brothers, Vincent and Philip, that Aniello would get his formal introduction into the family business. The Manganos weren't glamorous. They weren't brash like the Capones or theatrical like the Bananos. They operated quietly, efficiently, like a corporation with a mean streak. And Aniello fit their mold perfectly. He started small, as all wise guys did, collecting debts, driving, delivering envelopes. But there was an intensity in how he did it. Not the kind that screamed ambition. He never bragged, never sought attention. But word spread about how he handled problems, how he handled people. There was a story, told in low voices, about a man who refused to pay up. Aniello didn't beat him. He didn't break his fingers. He simply stood in the man's living room, looking at a photograph of the guy's daughter on the mantel. Then he looked the man in the eye and asked if she walked to school alone. No shouting, no blood, but the debt was paid the next morning. That was his power, restraint laced with the threat of precision violence. Like a scalpel in a world of sledgehammers. The city changed as the decade went on. The Mafia was no longer just a collection of local crews. It was evolving into something bigger, smarter, more organized. The five families began to take shape under the commission, a system designed to keep the peace while dividing the spoils. But peace in that world was always temporary. There were always tensions, always rivalries. And Aniello was moving up right in the middle of it. He became a made man in his late 20s. The ceremony was held in the back of a butcher shop near Little Italy. No candlelight mysticism, no Latin chants, just an oath, a pinprick of blood, and a promise, to the family, to the code, to death before betrayal. It wasn't religion. It was something older, something primal, a pact of shadows. From that point on, he was no longer just a soldier. He was an enforcer, a protector of the code. And for the Manganos, that meant doing more than collecting money or keeping the books clean. It meant eliminating threats, quietly, cleanly, with no witnesses and no traces. And Dellacroce excelled. In 1939, the docks were chaos. The unions were fracturing under pressure from both the government and rival crews. The Manganos had long held influence over the International Longshoremen's Association, and they weren't about to lose control. That's when Aniello was sent in, not with a crew, not with a show of force. Just him and one small-caliber revolver tucked into his waistband. By the end of the week, 3 union organizers had suddenly changed their tune. One disappeared. One recanted. The third fell from a rooftop in what police called a tragic accident. But everyone who mattered knew. And that's when his nickname started circulating in hushed tones. The Monk. It wasn't about religion. It was about the way he carried himself. Stoic. Disciplined. Almost ascetic. He didn't drink much. Didn't chase women. Didn't run his mouth. He wasn't a brute. He was a believer in the life, in the rules, in the structure. And he enforced that belief with terrifying efficiency. The other wise guys respected him, but they were also unnerved. There was something about him that didn't feel street. He didn't need to prove he was dangerous. You just knew. And then, in the early 1940s, the old order began to buckle. The Manganos were growing uneasy with Anastasia, whose hunger for power was becoming hard to ignore. Tensions flared. Paranoia crept in. The Mangano brothers began suspecting that Anastasia was plotting something darker, something final. And in the middle of it all stood Dellacroce, loyal to Anastasia, but sworn to the family that had brought him in. The weight of that loyalty began to bend him. There's a story from those years, never confirmed, but whispered like gospel. Dellacroce was called to a meeting, told to make a choice. Mangano or Anastasia, family or blood. And he didn't speak for a long time, just stared down at the table, motionless. Finally, he stood, said thank you, and walked out. The next week, Philip Mangano's body was found in a marsh near Sheepshead Bay. Vincent disappeared completely, vanished, as if the earth had swallowed him whole. It was never proven. No charges, no trial. But the street knew. That wasn't a coincidence. That was a message. One that said the old order had collapsed, and Dellacroce had chosen his god. Anastasia took full control of the family not long after and rebranded it under his own name. And Dellacroce? He was elevated to capo. Now he had his own crew, his own territory, and the authority to enforce not just orders, but silence. By then, the world had changed again. The Second World War was winding down, and New York was booming. But in the shadows, business was booming too. Loan sharking, racketeering, gambling, labor rackets, it was all thriving. And Dellacroce ran it like a priest runs a parish. With ritual, with order, with fear. But not everyone feared him the same way. To the young guys coming up, the new soldiers, the button men, he was a figure of awe. They watched how he moved, how he never raised his voice, never showed anger, but always got what he wanted. He taught them that real power doesn't scream. It whispers and still gets heard. But to his enemies, he was something else entirely. A phantom, a ghost in the pews. You never saw him coming. You never heard the shot. One minute you were sipping espresso, and the next, you were bleeding into your Sunday paper. And yet, despite the body count, despite the growing influence, he was never flashy, never sloppy. He kept his home modest. He kept his profile low. He understood that in this world, the nail that sticks out gets hammered first. He wasn't in this for fame. He was in this for something deeper, an unwavering belief in the life. But that belief would soon be tested. By 1951, the commission was growing wary of Anastasia's erratic style, his penchant for public violence, his refusal to play politics. And as pressure built behind the scenes, Dellacroce once again found himself at the crossroads of loyalty and survival. The man who had brought him into the upper circle was now a marked man. And Dellacroce would have to decide, again, where his true allegiance lay. He didn't flinch. He never did. But behind those cold eyes, the storm was already brewing. And as the whispers of betrayal began to echo through the underworld, one thing became clear. The monk was no longer just enforcing the rules. He was about to start rewriting them. And in the silence before the storm, the most dangerous men are always the ones who speak the least. Chapter 3. Meeting Albert Anastasia. He first saw the man who would change his life in a smoky backroom thick with the scent of sweat, cigar smoke, and quiet menace. The room wasn't large, but it felt endless. The kind of place where time stood still, where deals were made with nods and lives were erased with shrugs. Aniello Dellacroce, barely in his 20s, stood against the wall, trying not to blink. He wasn't supposed to speak. Not yet. Just listen. Watch. Absorb. Across from him sat Albert Anastasia, the executioner in flesh. If you've ever stood too close to a fire, you know the feeling. The heat creeps up slow, then smacks you all at once. That was Anastasia's presence. His stare could sear the skin. His smile could freeze blood. He wasn't just feared. He was myth, wrapped in flesh and adorned with power. The man who helped shape Murder Incorporated, who had bathed the streets in blood and never once flinched. For Dellacroce, this wasn't just an introduction. It was an awakening. Anastasia didn't recruit people. He summoned them. And Dellacroce had been summoned. It wasn't because he was the biggest or loudest. It was because he was invisible when he needed to be and dangerous when he chose to be. That paradox, the silent man with thunder behind his eyes, caught Anastasia's attention like a spark in the dark. Men like Anastasia didn't trust easily, but he saw something in Dellacroce that reminded him of himself. A coldness, a discipline, a rage disguised as control. The apprenticeship wasn't formal. There was no ceremony, just orders, tasks, tests. One night, Dellacroce was handed a name and a location. No explanation, no backup, just a nod. What happened next wasn't documented. But when he returned, alone, with dirt on his cuffs and silence on his face, Anastasia looked up from his chair, said nothing, and handed him a glass of bourbon. That was the moment. The unspoken welcome into the inner circle of the most feared killer in the American underworld. Murder Incorporated wasn't a crew. It was a machine. A ghost syndicate of killers who moved like shadows and struck with surgical precision. They were the hammer of the syndicate, the nameless faces behind the headlines. Dellacroce didn't just participate. He adapted, blended into the machinery like oil into gears. The jobs weren't about anger. They were about order, discipline. If the Mafia was a church, Murder Incorporated was its inquisition, and Dellacroce became one of its quiet priests. He learned to read people like blueprints. How they stood, how they breathed, how fear shaped their shoulders. He learned to strike not when it was easiest, but when it was most necessary. It wasn't about making noise. It was about erasing noise. And Anastasia, the maestro of murder, guided him with brutal mentorship. He didn't praise. He didn't coddle. But he gave Dellacroce something far more powerful, his trust. The streets whispered about Dellacroce, but never too loudly. The ghost, they called him. The silent monk. He didn't crave attention. He craved perfection. When others drank and laughed after jobs, Dellacroce cleaned his weapon, knelt in prayer, and vanished into the shadows. It wasn't religion. It was ritual. His own private balance between damnation and discipline. Anastasia watched this transformation with quiet satisfaction. He knew that soldiers like Dellacroce were rare. Most men let power corrode them. Dellacroce let it shape him, mold him, turn him into something that didn't flinch at blood or hesitation. Yet beneath the ice, there was something deeper, a loyalty that bordered on obsession. Dellacroce would never betray the man who made him. Not for money, not for fear, not even for life itself. The jobs kept coming. Some were routine, others were nightmares. There was one hit in the winter of 1944, a high-level informant who had slipped through the cracks. The target had barricaded himself inside a tenement apartment in the Bronx, surrounded by cops, neighbors, and the freezing wind. Dellacroce didn't wait for the all-clear. He walked through the back alley, climbed the fire escape, slipped through a bathroom window, and walked out 20 minutes later with blood on his collar and silence in his steps. The papers called it an unsolvable mystery. Dellacroce called it Tuesday. But power has a scent, and others began to smell it on him. Rivals, allies, even other bosses. Anastasia's favor wasn't a gift, it was a target. The more he leaned on Dellacroce, the more others wondered, who is this quiet man becoming? And what happens when the mentor is gone? Still, Dellacroce remained unwavering. He never spoke out of turn, never made a scene. He learned from Anastasia how to blend violence with discipline, a skill more valuable than gold in the Cosa Nostra. Other young wise guys wanted flash. Dellacroce wanted focus. He dressed modestly, kept a low profile. His vice, if any, was ritual, a strict daily routine. Church every Sunday, family dinners in silence. A man split between the sacred and the profane. He once told a soldier, "If you hesitate, you're dead. If you brag, you're next." That was his creed. Quiet hands, steady heart, absolute loyalty. It wasn't about fear. It was about purpose. Anastasia had given him that purpose, a place where his cold nature could serve order, not chaos. Murder Incorporated wasn't just a job. It was the crucible where he was forged. But even steel bends under pressure, and the world outside was shifting. The commission was growing uneasy with Anastasia's increasingly erratic behavior. His rage, once useful, was now seen as dangerous. He ordered hits without approval, claimed territories without discussion. The very unpredictability that made him a legend also made him a liability. Dellacroce saw it happening in slow motion. He watched the rooms grow quieter when Anastasia entered, watched the loyal turn cautious, He said nothing, but he knew. The mentor who taught him silence and precision was becoming the kind of man who could be silenced himself. One afternoon, Anastasia summoned Dellacroce alone. No guards, no capos, just the two of them. He poured a drink and stared into the glass for a long time. Then he said, "If something happens to me, you remember what I taught you." Dellacroce didn't reply. He just nodded once, slowly. That was the last time they spoke face to face. Months later, the barbershop hit sent shockwaves through the underworld. Albert Anastasia, gunned down mid-shave in a Manhattan hotel, left bleeding on the white tile floor like a scene from a horror film. No one claimed it. Everyone understood it. The executioner had been executed. And in the silence that followed, one man did not weep, did not speak, did not ask questions. Dellacroce simply folded the paper, lit a cigarette, and went to church. The loss cut deep, not just because Anastasia had been a mentor, but because Dellacroce had learned to believe in something, a structure, a discipline, a code. And now that code had taken his master. It was a bitter lesson in the very rules he had been taught to follow. No one is safe, not even the most feared, especially not the most feared. Still, he did not flinch. Instead, he absorbed the lesson, understood its weight, and began to build his own place within the vacuum left behind. He would not rage. He would not seek revenge. He would do what he had always done, move silently, strike only when necessary, and wait for the storm to pass. But in that waiting, something began to stir. A shift. Dellacroce was no longer just a soldier. He was a name now, a presence, the kind of man others whispered about when the lights were low, the kind of man young soldiers tried to emulate, and older bosses quietly feared. And as the Gambino family rose from the ashes of Anastasia's reign, a new power structure began to form. One that would push Dellacroce into the heart of a family on the brink of both greatness and destruction. The silent monk had survived the fire, but the storm was only just beginning. Chapter 4: Murder Incorporated and Mafia Loyalty. The room smelled of old sweat, smoke, and blood, not metaphorically. A man lay motionless in the corner of the dim apartment, his shirt soaked through, the final breath stolen from him in silence. And standing in the shadows, stone still, was Aniello Dellacroce. No panic, no hesitation, just a long, cold stare at the body, as if it were a broken piece of machinery rather than a man. This wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. By the late 1930s, Dellacroce had become a name whispered among hitmen, captains, and ambitious wise guys climbing their way up the Mafia's blood-soaked ladder. But he didn't shout for attention. He didn't crack jokes or throw punches in bars to prove his worth. He was quiet, always watching, always calculating. It was that silence that unnerved even the most seasoned killers. Murder Incorporated, the enforcement arm of the National Crime Syndicate, was a phantom organization born from the dark marriage of Italian and Jewish crime bosses like Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky. It was the syndicate's execution squad, dealing out death with chilling efficiency. Rumors swirled in backrooms and alleys that Aniello Dellacroce was tied to it, maybe not by formal initiation, but by purpose and skill. He never spoke about it, not to anyone. Dellacroce was a man of omerta, the sacred code of silence that held Cosa Nostra together like rusted bolts on an aging ship. For him, omerta wasn't just a rule. It was scripture. Violating it was worse than death. You didn't talk. You didn't explain. You obeyed, and if asked, you killed. Simple. In that simplicity, Aniello found clarity. In his early 30s, he was already known as a loyal enforcer, a shadow you didn't see coming until the barrel kissed your temple. His calm nature was disarming. A man who could sit across from you at dinner, ask about your kids, compliment the pasta sauce, and an hour later have you buried in a Jersey landfill. He never showed remorse, but he never reveled in it either. Killing, for Dellacroce, wasn't about power. It was obligation. To the bosses, that made him valuable. To the streets, it made him feared. Dellacroce's name started appearing in confidential informant reports around this time, flagged alongside suspected murders tied to internal mafia discipline, men who had skimmed, disrespected orders, or had simply become liabilities. Though he was never charged, investigators quietly believed he had pulled the trigger on at least a dozen hits. Each time, he vanished like smoke. No witnesses, no evidence, no motive anyone would speak about. In the tightly wound world of organized crime, silence is often louder than words. Dellacroce's silence roared. Unlike other men who craved recognition, he buried his ambition deep. He was the kind of soldier who showed up, got the job done, and disappeared before you could blink. The bosses noticed. In 1950, a major shift occurred. Albert Anastasia, the infamous Lord High Executioner, had risen to the top of the Mangano family. He respected violence when it served order, and he saw a kindred spirit in Dellacroce. Anastasia didn't want hotheads. He wanted professionals. Dellacroce was that. Reliable, efficient, emotionless. Their relationship remained mostly business, but Dellacroce saw something in Anastasia, a mentor figure, perhaps. They didn't drink together. They didn't share secrets, but they understood each other. In the Mafia, that's as close to friendship as it gets. When a contract came down, it wasn't always clear why. A name, a time, sometimes not even that. Just a phone call, a look, a nod at Sunday dinner. Dellacroce understood. He didn't need context. There's an old saying in the mob. If you ask why, you're next. One night in 1951, a made man named Rocco Rinaldi vanished after a heated sit-down. He had argued with a capo, raised his voice, accused someone of stealing from a union kickback. A week later, they found what was left of him in a burned-out warehouse, teeth shattered, fingers broken, 3 bullets in the back of the head, classic overkill. FBI files later noted Dellacroce's car had been parked near the area that night. But no charges stuck. Dellacroce never mentioned it. He never mentioned any of them. To the FBI, he became a phantom. To the underworld, a myth. To his bosses, indispensable. By the mid-1950s, Dellacroce had become a trusted earner, running gambling rings, loan shark operations, and quietly skimming profits from construction rackets. He didn't draw headlines. He didn't flash cash. He funneled money with surgical precision, kept his mouth shut, and delivered envelopes on time. He was becoming the kind of man mafia empires are built on. But being loyal to the wrong boss can be fatal. In 1957, the world around Dellacroce would shift violently. Anastasia, the man who had trusted him, who had built him, was gunned down in a Manhattan barbershop in broad daylight. The hit sent tremors through the 5 families. No one had seen it coming, except those who had. It was Carlo Gambino who took the reins next. He had been part of the conspiracy to remove Anastasia, quietly orchestrating a power grab with the help of Vito Genovese and other high-ranking bosses. It was treachery masked as strategy. Gambino had played his cards perfectly. Dellacroce had a choice. Revenge his old boss and die, or adapt. He didn't flinch. Many thought he would go rogue, that his loyalty to Anastasia would drive him to retaliation. But Aniello did what few expected. He bowed, not out of cowardice, but survival. He understood the rules. Power changes hands. That's the game. Gambino, impressed by Dellacroce's discipline, and perhaps wary of his deadly reputation, made him underboss. It was a calculated move. Keep the silent killer close, give him power, and avoid future betrayal. Dellacroce accepted, without emotion, without a word. Inside, he may have mourned Anastasia. Or maybe he didn't. We'll never know. What we do know is this. Aniello Dellacroce had reached the second highest seat in the most powerful crime family in America. And he did it without ever raising his voice. He operated out of the Rave Night Social Club, a cramped, nicotine-stained room in Little Italy where strategy and death sentences were handed out over espresso and cannoli. From that corner booth, Dellacroce continued to manage murders, money, and men with the same cold efficiency he always had. But something changed in him after Anastasia's death. He became even more reserved, even more devout. His Catholic beliefs, already part of his persona, deepened. He would sit for hours in near silence, thumbing a rosary, as if trying to reconcile the blood on his hands with the cross around his neck. To outsiders, it seemed like hypocrisy. But to Dellacroce, it made perfect sense. Sin was inevitable. Regret was useless. Only obedience mattered. There's a moment described by an FBI informant, one of the few glimpses we get into Dellacroce's psyche. A young soldier had botched a collection. He begged for forgiveness, made excuses, blamed the victim. Dellacroce didn't raise his voice. He simply leaned in and whispered, "Do you think Jesus made excuses on the cross?" The room fell silent. The soldier was never seen again. This was Dellacroce's world. A crucifix in one hand, a .38 in the other. Murder wasn't about rage. It was about keeping the family intact. Like pruning a tree, cut off the sick branches before they rot the rest. And when the order came, he never hesitated. His legend grew in whispers. There were stories of him walking into a bar, nodding once, and clearing out a room of wise guys who didn't want to risk breathing the same air. Others claimed he had once calmly finished his coffee while two men lay dead in the next room, waiting until the cleanup crew arrived. No one knew how many people he had killed, but everyone knew the number wasn't small. And yet, he was respected, deeply, not out of fear alone, but because Dellacroce followed the rules. In a world built on chaos, he was structure. He believed in the old ways, loyalty, tradition, silence. He didn't cheat. He didn't steal from his own. In his presence, even made men stood straighter. Still, the streets were changing. The old code was eroding. Drugs were flooding in. Younger mobsters, louder, greedier, began climbing the ranks. Dellacroce watched it all unfold like a man watching cracks form in a dam. He didn't yell. He didn't panic. He just waited, because he knew something was coming, something that would test every oath he had ever taken. And the next name about to enter his world would shatter the quiet order he had spent decades building. John Gotti was coming. Chapter 5, Blood in the Barbershop, the Death of Anastasia. The mirror was foggy, the air thick with the scent of talcum powder and warm shaving cream. A pair of scissors clicked in rhythm, echoing faintly off the tile walls. At the Park Sheraton Hotel in Midtown Manhattan, on a chilly October morning in 1957, Albert Anastasia stepped into the barbershop chair for what he thought would be a routine trim. His jacket hung neatly by the door. His bodyguard had stepped away, and the silent monk, Aniello Dellacroce, was nowhere in sight. Then the door opened. Two figures entered, trench coats buttoned, hats pulled low. They didn't hesitate. No warning. No exchange. Just a flurry of bullets that tore through flesh and bone like razors through silk. The barber dove for cover. Anastasia, once feared as the Lord High Executioner, lurched forward in confusion, his eyes wide in disbelief. Some say he saw his killers in the mirror and lunged toward the reflection, mistaking it for his attackers. Others believe he tried to fight back, even as death closed in. But when the smoke cleared, the king was gone. His body crumpled in a spray of shattered glass and blood. The murder sent shockwaves through the underworld. A boss, gunned down in broad daylight. A man who had ruled with violence, now silenced by it. For Aniello Dellacroce, the news landed like a punch to the gut. He was more than a loyal underboss to Anastasia. He was his disciple. The silent monk had served under the old-school Don with devotion that bordered on reverence. Now, with Anastasia gone, the foundation beneath Dellacroce's feet began to shift. For years, Dellacroce had followed Anastasia's brutal, almost sacred, code. Violence was a tool, yes, but it was also ritual, purposeful, calculated. Anastasia had taught him that fear was power and loyalty was currency. But the way Anastasia was taken out, so public, so cold, it violated that unspoken tradition. It wasn't just a hit. It was an execution of everything they had stood for. In the hours following the assassination, Dellacroce stayed silent. He didn't ask questions. He didn't scream revenge. He didn't need to. The message was already clear. The knives had been out for Anastasia for months. His erratic behavior, his insatiable hunger for power, and his blatant disregard for the Commission's quiet order had made him a liability. The old world was being replaced, subtlety over spectacle, diplomacy over brute force. And in the shadows, Carlo Gambino stepped forward. It didn't happen overnight. Gambino, soft-spoken and almost forgettable to the untrained eye, had been waiting. Watching. He played the long game. Always had. A master of patience. He had aligned himself with Vito Genovese, maneuvered politically while Anastasia made enemies. And now, with the chair still warm and blood barely dry, Gambino became boss of what would soon be known as the Gambino crime family. Dellacroce, though shaken, didn't challenge it. Many expected him to. After all, he was Anastasia's right hand. He could command soldiers. He had the respect, the fear, the legacy. But he didn't move. He kept his emotions buried behind those hooded eyes. Some say he was biding his time. Others believe he accepted that the winds had changed, and to resist would mean war. Dellacroce had seen enough blood. He chose to bend rather than break. Still, the pain lingered. To Dellacroce, loyalty was not just a code, it was a religion. Betrayal felt like blasphemy. He hadn't just lost a boss. He'd lost a mentor, a father figure. And now, he had to stand beside the man who likely had a hand in that death. Gambino, to his credit, was no fool. He understood the power Dellacroce held. He didn't try to sideline him. Instead, he offered Dellacroce what he wanted most: stability, respect, and a future. He kept Dellacroce as his underboss, an unspoken peace offering. And Dellacroce, ever the soldier, accepted. But things would never be the same. The family changed almost immediately. Under Gambino, the bloodletting slowed. The flashiness of Anastasia's reign faded into the shadows. Gambino moved like a ghost, building a criminal empire through whispers rather than gunfire. Dellacroce, though cut from a different cloth, adapted. He kept the young soldiers in line, handled the dirtiest of tasks, and ensured the old-school values didn't vanish completely. Yet in private, Dellacroce mourned. He would sit in silence for hours, staring out windows, lost in thought. He never spoke Anastasia's name again. But it haunted him: the barbershop, the bullets, the betrayal. He knew how the game worked. He had played it long enough. But this had cut deeper than he expected. In quiet moments, he would light a cigarette, his hands steady, his eyes unreadable. Those close to him said he changed after Anastasia's murder. More distant, more guarded. The rage never showed, but it simmered, like a pot kept just below boiling. He had seen what ambition could do. He had seen how quickly a throne could be turned into a coffin. Years later, whispers still floated in the backrooms of Brooklyn and Queens. That Dellacroce had known about the hit, that he had allowed it, that he had been promised something in return. But none of it stuck. Dellacroce's silence became his shield. No one could prove anything, and no one dared press him. He carried himself like a man who'd buried a piece of himself that day, and no one was brave enough to ask where. The death of Anastasia marked more than just a leadership change. It was the end of an era, the final breath of the murder-incorporated legacy, the last flicker of the old-world brutality that had once ruled New York's underworld. And Dellacroce, caught between two worlds, was left to bridge the divide. He did so with discipline, dignity, and deadly precision. Even as Gambino's influence grew, Dellacroce remained the man in the shadows, the one who understood violence like a poet understands pain. He didn't crave attention. He didn't flaunt power. He simply existed, respected, feared, and utterly untouchable. But something had changed, and Gambino noticed. Though he trusted Dellacroce, he never forgot that beneath that quiet surface was a man forged in war, a disciple of chaos who had now sworn himself to order. Gambino watched Dellacroce like a man watches fire in a dark room. Useful, warming, but always dangerous. The balance held, for now. Still, the memory of that day lingered in the family like smoke that never cleared. The barbershop chair, the broken mirror, the blood on tile. A warning, perhaps, or a prophecy. In this world, power didn't shift quietly. It arrived with echoes. And sometimes, it screamed. Aniello Dellacroce never spoke of that morning again. But he carried it with him. Every step, every silence, every decision. A man shaped by loyalty, now ruled by restraint. His path, forever altered. His allegiance, forever questioned. And deep inside, one question clawed at him. Had he chosen survival over justice? Or had he simply learned that in the Cosa Nostra, justice was just another word for who gets to write the ending? The answer never came, but it would resurface. Years later, in a courtroom, in a prison cell, in a young man named John Gotti, who would see Dellacroce not just as a mentor, but as a living relic of a time when loyalty meant something and silence was sacred. That day in the barber shop didn't just kill a boss. It rewrote the rules. It turned soldiers into politicians. It turned family into strategy. And it turned Aniello Dellacroce into a man forever standing between the past and a storm he couldn't yet see coming. The silent monk had survived the fire. But fires leave scars. And somewhere, far from the barber shop, a young generation watched in silence, learning, waiting, sharpening their knives, not for tradition, but for power. The Gambino family had a new king, but every king lives in the shadow of those who bled for the crown. Chapter 6. Carlo Gambino's Shadow. The year was 1957, and the streets of New York were boiling under the weight of change. Inside a quiet, dimly lit corner of a Brooklyn social club, Aniello Dellacroce sat stone-faced, smoke curling from the end of his cigarette, as Carlo Gambino offered him something that was both an honor and a humiliation. Not the top seat. No, that would go to Gambino himself, but the chair just beneath it. Underboss. The right hand. The silent shield behind the throne. And Dellacroce, the man known for ice in his veins and fire in his fists, said nothing at first. Just a nod. No bitterness. No protest. Just the same chilling stillness that made men around him sweat, even in winter. But that nod was the moment everything changed. In a world where ego could be fatal, Dellacroce's decision to remain loyal was more dangerous than betrayal. He had seniority, respect, a crew that feared him, and a reputation that could empty a room with a whisper. Yet he bent his pride to Carlo Gambino. He accepted being passed over for the crown, not out of weakness, but out of a deeper, colder calculation. Some men crave the spotlight. Aniello Dellacroce learned long ago that true power lives in the shadows. And from that day forward, he would become the most trusted and feared man in the entire Gambino empire. It wasn't just about structure or titles. It was about control. Gambino needed Dellacroce because no one else could keep the wolves in line. The streets were filled with ambition, violence, and betrayal, all of it wrapped in silk suits and false smiles. Dellacroce's presence alone kept the lower ranks in check. He didn't need to yell. He didn't need to threaten. His eyes did the talking, and his eyes were dead. They called him the Polak behind his back, a jab at his pale features and silent demeanor. But no one dared say it to his face. He walked into a room like a ghost already halfway to the grave, calm, emotionless, with the kind of quiet you only hear before a gunshot. To the street soldiers, he was a mystery wrapped in ritual. Always respectful, always calculated. Never drunk, never loud, never out of control. His men said he could sit across from you, ask about your mother, and still have you buried by sundown without blinking. That was discipline, and it was terrifying. Gambino, for all his cunning, knew this was a gift. He ruled with brains, but Dellacroce ruled with fear. Together, they made the perfect equation. Gambino handled the politics, the judges, the unions, the lawyers. Dellacroce kept the street wild dogs from eating each other alive. He was the Vatican's enforcer in a criminal church. And his loyalty wasn't just about obedience. It was spiritual. He believed in the rules. The old ways. Honor, silence, structure. Like a monk, he saw the Mafia not as a business, but as a sacred order. Break the code, and you were excommunicated, with bullets. His headquarters became the Rave Night Social Club in Little Italy, a nondescript storefront with dirty windows and bad coffee. But inside, it was a temple. Every conversation, every nod, every breath inside that room was measured. Men sat with their hands visible, their voices low. No one dared lie. Dellacroce would know. He always knew. He could smell deception like blood in the water. But for all his fearsome presence, Dellacroce carried a strange sadness behind his eyes. He was a man who had accepted a life of violence and silence, but not without cost. He rarely spoke of his family. He rarely smiled. Some say he never truly trusted anyone, not even Carlo. But he served. Day after day, year after year, he enforced the will of a man who wore the crown he himself had earned. And yet he never showed resentment, only discipline. There was one time, a story whispered between made men. When a crew captain from Brooklyn challenged Gambino's decision, suggesting Dellacroce was the real boss in the streets. A power play. Dellacroce could have crushed him. Instead, he called him into a quiet backroom, closed the door, and spoke just 3 sentences. No threats, no yelling, just cold truth. The captain left white as a sheet, resigned the next day, and was never heard from again. That was Dellacroce's way. No fireworks, just finality. In this new era of the Gambino family, Dellacroce became more than an underboss. He became myth. To the old guard, he was the guardian of tradition. To the young upstarts, he was the final test. If you wanted to rise, you had to pass through Dellacroce. And most didn't survive the scrutiny. He saw through ambition like glass. Gambino used this to his advantage. While he met quietly with politicians and foreign bankers, Dellacroce kept the heartbeat of the street steady. He oversaw loan sharking, extortion, narcotics, and enforcement with an almost religious precision. Every dollar was accounted for. Every broken rule had consequences. He once said to a soldier, "We don't kill for money. We kill for discipline." It wasn't about greed. It was about order. And in Dellacroce's world, order was sacred. There were moments, though, when the pressure showed. Late at night, after meetings ended and the streets fell quiet, Dellacroce would sit alone in the back of the rave night, chain-smoking, staring at nothing. Not reading, not writing, just sitting, as if waiting for something to end. A few close associates said he spoke in riddles during those times. About ghosts, about God, about the cost of being a shadow. And yet, despite the weight of the life he carried, Dellacroce never flinched. When word came down of a hit, he signed off without emotion. When arrests happened, he expected silence. He once told a young soldier, "You don't cry when you go to jail. You cry when you talk." That was the creed. Silence wasn't just a rule, it was a virtue. The FBI, by now, had begun to notice something strange about the Gambino family. Unlike the other families, where betrayal, wiretaps, and infighting were becoming rampant, the Gambinos seemed immune. Tighter, colder, more lethal. It wasn't Gambino's brilliance alone that kept the machine running. It was Dellacroce's invisible hand, moving behind the scenes like a puppeteer in the dark. But not everyone was comfortable with this dynamic. Beneath the surface, a storm was building. Younger guys, louder guys, ambitious and reckless, were watching Dellacroce with impatience. Men like John Gotti, who respected him deeply but also saw him as a gatekeeper to the throne. And while Dellacroce believed in discipline, the next generation believed in dollars. Fast ones, flashy ones. And in that difference lay the seeds of a future war. Gambino was aging. Slower. Rumors of illness circulated like whispers through the underworld. And everyone knew, when he was gone, the question wouldn't be who should lead, but who would. And all eyes would look to Dellacroce. But Dellacroce had already made peace with his position. He never wanted the title. He didn't need the ceremony. His power wasn't in the spotlight. It was in the silence behind it. And yet, his refusal to seize the throne would one day create a power vacuum so deep, it would crack the entire foundation of the family. The moment would come soon, closer than anyone knew, when Gambino would name his successor. And it wouldn't be Aniello Dellacroce. That decision would change everything. Because in the underworld, loyalty is a double-edged blade. And shadows, no matter how loyal, can only hold the darkness back for so long. And when the name Paul Castellano was whispered as the next in line, Dellacroce stayed quiet. But not everyone else would. Chapter 7. The Rave Night Social Club. A thin fog rolled over Mulberry Street, blanketing the pavement in a quiet gray as if the city itself was holding its breath. Beneath a dim street lamp in Little Italy, the silhouette of a modest storefront flickered into view. Unremarkable to the untrained eye, but to those who knew, it was the beating heart of a criminal empire. The sign above read, Rave Night Social Club, but it could have just as easily said Sanctuary of Shadows. This was no mere clubhouse. It was a shrine, a throne room cloaked in smoke and silence, and the man seated inside was its high priest, Aniello Dellacroce. It wasn't always this way. Before the rave night became the nerve center of Dellacroce's world, It was just another fading relic from a bygone era. But like everything else Aniello touched, it was transformed by his quiet intensity. He didn't need to shout or threaten. His presence alone twisted the air, like the sound of a match being struck in an oxygen-rich room. Inside those walls, deals were made, loyalty was tested, and the weight of the Gambino family's future often sat in the space between two silent nods. The year was 1976, and Carlo Gambino had just died. The family teetered on the edge of chaos. Power, once concentrated in the aging Don's hands, now threatened to fracture between two opposing forces, Paul Castellano and Aniello Dellacroce. While Castellano inherited the official title, Dellacroce inherited something more potent, the loyalty of the streets. Soldiers, captains, old-timers, they knew who had bled beside them, who had kept his mouth shut through decades of indictments and close calls. It wasn't the man in the mansion with manicured hands. It was the monk in the rave night. The rave night was not luxurious. No chandeliers, no velvet ropes, no marble floors. Just a few tables, worn chairs, and walls yellowed by decades of cigarette smoke. But it pulsed with something primal. Each creak of the door could bring a promotion, a death sentence, or worse, exile. Dellacroce would sit by the window, a cup of black coffee in hand, staring at nothing and everything. Men would enter whispering and leave either emboldened or broken. No one interrupted when Aniello was thinking. That kind of silence didn't come from fear, it came from reverence. And still, Dellacroce never sought power for power's sake. Unlike Castellano, who craved control with the vanity of a businessman polishing his public image, Dellacroce operated from principle. To him, the Mafia was a sacred code, not a corporate ladder. The rave night wasn't just a headquarters, it was a temple to the old ways. Omerta wasn't a word, it was a sacrament. Respect wasn't earned through bloodlines, it was forged in the fire of risk and resilience. Even federal agents began referring to the place as the Vatican. Surveillance vans parked nearby, day and night, trying to pierce the veil. But it was like trying to listen through concrete. The FBI could photograph who entered and left, but they couldn't record the atmosphere, the gravity that held everything together. Dellacroce followers called him the Pope of Mulberry Street, not out of mockery, but because that was how he led, with a quiet, uncompromising devotion to a code he never broke. Underneath this veneer of solemnity, however, was a storm building. The rave night was becoming more than just a clubhouse. It was becoming a symbol of division. As Castellano expanded his influence from his Staten Island compound, he focused on white-collar rackets, distancing the family from street-level action. But Dellacroce remained grounded in the asphalt. His faction trafficked in what made the family powerful in the first place: loan sharking, extortion, and drug money. Castellano forbade narcotics, but in reality, many of Dellacroce's loyalists were knee-deep in it. They had mouths to feed, crews to run, and wars to win. Dellacroce knew it. He didn't encourage it, but he understood it. In this life, morality was often a luxury. There was a moment, one that few outside the inner circle ever knew, that revealed just how sacred the rave night had become. One late evening, a young soldier named Anthony had been summoned. He had violated a code, spoken too freely to a girl, careless with names. A rookie mistake, but one that could unravel much more. As he walked through the Ravenide's door, his hands trembled, not from fear of death, but from the knowledge that he might disappoint the one man whose respect couldn't be bought or begged for. Dellacroce didn't raise his voice. He simply looked the kid in the eye and asked, "Are you ready to die for your mistake?" The question didn't carry rage, it carried weight. Anthony nodded, and Dellacroce nodded back. "Then live like you mean it," he said. The kid walked out a different man. The rave night had transformed him. That was Dellacroce's power. He didn't need to punish. His silence punished you more than violence ever could. As the divide between Castellano's ivory tower and Dellacroce's smoke-filled sanctuary widened, tensions thickened. Gotti, Gravano, Ruggiero, the new blood was loyal not to the official boss, but to the monk. And that loyalty was sealed within the Ravenites' walls, where they came not just to receive orders, but to absorb a philosophy. Where Castellano saw himself as CEO, Dellacroce played the part of an old general, one who had fought too many battles to be dazzled by new uniforms. But the club wasn't bulletproof. The FBI had begun planting bugs in nearby storefronts. Microphones hidden in light fixtures, cameras buried in electrical panels. The agents watched, listened, waited, like fishermen casting lines into a bottomless sea. Yet Dellacroce remained untouched. He spoke in riddles, nodded instead of instructed, and operated in whispers. If law enforcement wanted to trap him, they had to guess what he was thinking. And Aniello didn't make guessing easy. Behind the curtain of respect, though, the monk carried a burden few could see. He was trapped between loyalty to Carlo Gambino's dying wish that Castellano lead, and his own knowledge that the streets no longer respected the man in charge. He couldn't defy the old Don, but he also couldn't deny the frustration growing within his faction. The rave night had become a volcano, and Dellacroce sat at its mouth, trying to hold back the eruption with sheer will. Even his health began to reflect the strain. His once upright frame stooped lower with each passing year. He developed a persistent cough, his complexion pale. But he never let on. The rave night remained his post, his pulpit, his battlefield. No matter the pain, no matter the politics, he showed up, every day, without fail. To the younger soldiers, this was religion. To the feds, it was obsession. In 1983, the FBI recorded something unusual. Not a conversation, but a silence. 3 capos sat with Dellacroce for over an hour without a single audible instruction. When they left, one of them made a move on a rival crew. It wasn't what Dellacroce said, it was what he didn't have to say. The rave night was more than a location. It was a language. But time was no longer on Aniello's side. Castellano's leadership grew weaker, more isolated, and the whispers around the rave night turned into open frustrations. Dellacroce had spent his life preaching loyalty to the code, but even codes can bend under pressure. The rave night became a refuge not just for criminals, but for disillusioned believers, those who felt the old ways slipping through their fingers. On one particularly cold night in late November of 1985, Dellacroce sat at his usual spot, wrapped in a long black overcoat, staring at the storefront glass that reflected his own tired face. Outside, the city moved on, oblivious. Inside, his loyalists waited for a sign, any sign, that the tide would turn. But Dellacroce remained still, haunted by the weight of an empire he could no longer control. Then, the door creaked open. Gotti stepped inside. He didn't speak right away. He didn't have to. Dellacroce looked up and saw it. The spark, the impatience, the quiet fury in Gotti's eyes. The kind that wouldn't wait forever. The kind that hinted at mutiny. Dellacroce took a long sip of his coffee, and for the first time in years, looked uncertain. The rave night had been his sanctuary, his sword, his shield. But now, it had become something else, an echo chamber for men ready to write their own commandments. Dellacroce could feel it, like a cold draft under the door. The revolution wasn't coming. It was already inside. And as he leaned back in his chair, weary and worn, one question lingered in the silence, heavy and unspoken. If the monk couldn't hold the walls, who would? Chapter 8. The Face of Fear. He sat at the end of the long mahogany table, motionless. His hands folded, his eyes lowered, as if he were in prayer. The only sound in the room was the steady ticking of a brass clock behind him. No one spoke. No one dared. Because even in silence, Aniello Dellacroce commanded the room. Without raising his voice. Without making a threat. Just his presence was enough to pull the air tight. That was the power of the silent monk. The first thing anyone noticed about Dellacroce wasn't what he said. It was what time had carved into his face. A deep, jagged scar ran from the corner of his right cheekbone, slicing downward across his mouth like a crooked second smile. His skin bore the texture of stone worn down by decades of violence, cigarette smoke, and cold winds off the Brooklyn waterfront. One side of his face drooped slightly, as if time had tugged it down with invisible chains. But his eyes, that was where the real fear lived. Cold, distant, like deep water you couldn't see the bottom of. That scar told a story he never bothered to share. Some whispered it came from a razor during a brutal prison brawl. Others said it was a message from a rival crew, meant to disfigure him into obedience. But Dellacroce had kept walking, bleeding, and never flinched. The truth didn't matter. The myth was stronger than the facts. And myths are what turn gangsters into legends. They called him the Polak, though he was half Italian, half German. But it was another nickname, more reverent, more terrifying, that would define him. The silent monk. It wasn't just his quiet demeanor. It was the way he moved through the world, deliberate, detached, as if already halfway between this life and the next. He wasn't flamboyant like Gotti, didn't dress in silk suits or gold chains. Dellacroce wore dark shirts, worn shoes, and kept his hair combed back like a funeral director. He didn't smile much, and when he did, it rarely reached his eyes. To many, he looked more like a mortician than a mob boss. And in some ways, he was. He cleaned up messes, buried bodies, silenced problems. He was the final conversation a man had before disappearing forever. But he never raised his voice, never shouted. That was part of the fear. He didn't need to. He could sit across from a man and simply look at him. No threats, no words, just that stare. Cold, unreadable, and final, like death coming up the stairs. He understood the power of silence. In a world filled with loudmouths and showboats, Dellacroce's quiet became its own kind of weapon. He spoke in short, clipped phrases, let others talk themselves into a corner, made men sweat under his gaze. And when he did speak, his voice was low and hoarse, like gravel underfoot. Every word was deliberate, weighed, and chosen like a prayer uttered at midnight. To the outside world, he was a ghost. The newspapers barely mentioned him in the early years. He didn't make headlines like Vito Genovese or Joe Colombo. He didn't pose for cameras or strut in and out of courtrooms. But inside the underworld, his name carried weight like a cinder block dropped into a river. He'd walk into a room, and conversations would die mid-sentence. Young soldiers straightened their backs. Veterans looked away. Even capos nodded, respectfully, nervously. Dellacroce didn't command respect. He absorbed it. He lived on the top floor of a modest three-story house in Staten Island. Neighbors said he was polite, kept to himself, mowed his own lawn. But at night, black sedans pulled up with tinted windows, and heavy men in long coats came and went without saying a word. Inside those walls, the old rules were preserved, Cosa Nostra as it was meant to be. Oaths sworn in blood, loyalty above life. He kept a prayer book beside his bed and a pistol under his pillow. Some said he lit candles every Sunday for the souls of the men he'd buried. One story floated around the streets like smoke. A young associate, barely 20, had botched a job. Something simple. A warning, not a hit. But instead, the kid had panicked, pulled the trigger, killed a man who wasn't supposed to die. When he came to Dellacroce to explain, he was shaking, rambling, expecting to be shot on the spot. But Dellacroce just looked at him, said nothing. Then after a long pause, he leaned forward and whispered, "You can't unpull a trigger." The next day, the kid's body was found in the trunk of a Buick Skylark in Brooklyn. No bullet wounds, just a broken neck. That was how Dellacroce delivered justice. Calm, silent, and absolute. He didn't need to be theatrical. Fear did the heavy lifting for him. In an underworld powered by paranoia, his silence was its own kind of scream. Men would rehearse conversations with him in their heads for days, only to sit before him and forget how to speak. Even John Gotti, loud, brash, overflowing with confidence, lowered his eyes when speaking to Neil. He might have been the dapper Don, but Dellacroce was the one man who reminded him he was still mortal. But behind the menace, there was something else. A sadness, maybe. A weight he carried that no one else could see. He never spoke of his childhood, never mentioned his mother or his father. He'd grown up hard, scrapping in alleys, running numbers by 12, collecting debts by 15. Violence had been his teacher, silence his armor. By the time he was 30, he had buried more friends than most men lose in a war. Some say he had regrets, not about the blood or the power, but about what it cost him. He never married, had no known children, His closest companions were his bodyguards and the men he trusted to die for him. At night, when the meetings ended and the house went quiet, he'd sit alone by the window, a single lamp glowing behind him, watching the street, listening to the silence. A former FBI agent who trailed him for years once said, "Dellacroce could walk through a church and make the candles flicker." That wasn't hyperbole. That was his energy. Heavy, otherworldly, like he carried ghosts with him wherever he went. Even inside prison, he held the same eerie stillness. During a brief stint in the late 60s, inmates gave him space. Guards never turned their backs. He didn't start fights. He ended them. A shiv in the ribs. A sock filled with batteries. Then back to his bunk. Reading. Praying. Waiting. No one ever saw him lose his temper. But they saw what happened to those who crossed him. One bookmaker had skimmed off the top, just a few grand. Enough to think he could get away with it. The man vanished. Weeks later, his bones were found in a shallow grave near an abandoned diner in Jersey. Broken fingers. Crushed jaw. That was Dellacroce's message. You don't steal from the monk. He wasn't flashy, but he wasn't soft. He carried a revolver at all times. Knew how to use it. Had used it many times. But his real weapon was discipline. While others got sloppy, drugs, women, flash cash, Dellacroce kept his world tight. Clean. Controlled. He didn't trust easily. But once he did, he gave you his silence as protection. That meant more than 100 words. But even monsters have moments where the mask slips. In the fall of 1978, at a wake for an old friend in Queens, a reporter snuck in through a back entrance. Got a glimpse of Dellacroce standing by the casket. Alone. Head bowed. A single tear traced down the scarred side of his face. Just one. Then he wiped it, straightened his shoulders, and turned back into the stone figure everyone knew. The reporter never published the photo. Said it didn't feel right. That even the devil deserves his moments. By the early 80s, Dellacroce was a relic. But a feared one. Like a wolf too old to hunt. But still dangerous enough to tear your throat out if provoked. Younger wise guys saw him as a myth, a warning from another era. But Gotti saw something else. A mentor. A key. And Dellacroce saw Gotti as the future. That would be his final gamble. Because behind the quiet and the discipline, there was a storm brewing. The Gambino family was split. Paul Castellano sat on the throne, polished and paranoid. Gotti waited in the wings, hungry and brash. And in the middle was Dellacroce, caught between loyalty and legacy, bound by his oath, haunted by what he knew was coming. And though he never said it out loud, some believe he saw the end coming long before it arrived. The silent monk wasn't afraid of death, but he feared what his silence might unleash once he was gone. And that moment was getting closer. Chapter 9. Enforcing Omerta. It was 2 in the morning when the body turned up in the back seat of a Buick off Stillwell Avenue. No witnesses. No struggle. Just a single bullet through the temple and a mouth stuffed with a torn scrap of linen. A signal. A message that screamed louder than any confession. Silence is sacred. And Aniello Dellacroce made sure it stayed that way. They called him Mr. Underworld, but never to his face. In the shadows of New York's Mafia, Dellacroce wasn't just feared, he was revered. His presence could quiet a room the way a gust of cold wind silences birds. And above all, he was the high priest of Omerta, the Mafia's unbreakable code of silence. To Dellacroce, talking was worse than killing. A rat wasn't just an enemy of the family. They were an enemy of the very blood that bound it together. There were no second chances. Dellacroce had lived through enough betrayals to understand that words could kill faster than bullets. From his earliest days under Mangano to his rise under Gambino, he saw firsthand how law enforcement didn't need fingerprints or bodies. All they needed was one frightened voice behind a two-way mirror. And when that happened, it was like lighting a match in a warehouse soaked in gasoline. Everything burned. So he made sure the match never struck. He taught young wise guys early. You shut your mouth, even if it means your life. The oath wasn't symbolic. It was a contract sealed in blood and fear. If someone broke it, Dellacroce became judge, jury, and executioner. And his justice didn't come with a warning. One story filtered quietly through the underworld. A low-level associate out of Bensonhurst had been picked up for questioning. Nothing serious, just a weapons charge. But word got back that he'd mumbled something, maybe even speculated, about family business. The next morning, he was found slumped behind the wheel of a garbage truck, a .38 left neatly in his lap. Cops said suicide, but the men who knew Dellacroce knew better. There was never any yelling. No rage. Dellacroce didn't threaten. He didn't need to. His voice was low, almost tender, like a priest giving last rites. That made it worse. He had the calm of a man who'd already made peace with damnation, and that calm chilled everyone around him. But there was another reason Dellacroce clung to Omerta with such religious intensity. He knew the FBI was evolving. Surveillance was tightening. Bugs were planted in lamp fixtures, car dashboards, even crucifixes. Agents didn't need to see the crime. They only needed the chatter afterward. So Dellacroce waged war against words. He hated the sound of loose talk more than gunfire. He kept meetings short, coded, quiet. His headquarters inside the Rave Night Social Club was a hive of silence. No laughter, no shouting, just nods, handshakes, and eyes that said more than mouths ever could. If someone even hinted at business in public, Dellacroce would rise from his chair and leave mid-sentence. That's how much it repulsed him. He viewed media attention as a cancer. Flash, arrogance, ego, those were sins in his church. Where some bosses basked in limelight, Dellacroce recoiled. He watched the rise of John Gotti with wary eyes. The cameras, the swagger, the open defiance. To Dellacroce, it was dangerous. It was sacrilege. The Mafia was built on shadows, and shadows don't survive under spotlights. Even when lawmen tried to pull him into the open, Dellacroce stayed ghost-like. He dressed modestly, spoke less, smiled rarely. Reporters couldn't get a quote, not even a photograph. He moved like fog, always there, but impossible to catch. To those around him, he was more myth than man. But myths cast long shadows. Within the Gambino family, Dellacroce's authority on Omerta became absolute. He wasn't just enforcing rules, he was shaping culture. He reminded men that silence wasn't weakness. It was power. It was legacy. Talking made you weak. Listening made you survive. He often told younger soldiers about the old-timers, how in Sicily, fathers would rather kill their sons than let them cooperate with the state. To Dellacroce, that wasn't cruelty. That was honor. In his mind, talking to the government wasn't just betrayal. It was a betrayal of ancestry, of thousands of years of blood loyalty. Still, not everyone agreed. There were whispers behind Dellacroce's back that his devotion to tradition was outdated, that in a modern world, silence wasn't enough. Some wanted to outgun law enforcement, outspin them, outsmart them. Dellacroce didn't buy it. He believed the old ways were the only ways, and he'd go to the grave defending them. The real test came in the late 1970s, when federal prosecutors began flipping informants at a frightening rate. One by one, low-level associates began singing. Some made deals to avoid prison. Others, just to survive. The code was cracking, but not under Dellacroce's watch. He set an example. No cooperation, no confession, no compromise. And he expected the same from everyone beneath him. When Sammy Gravano recalled his early days under Dellacroce, he spoke of the terror and respect he felt. "You didn't lie to Neil," he said. "But you didn't tell him too much either." He didn't want stories. He wanted results. And silence. In private, Dellacroce mourned the changes. He saw the foundation of the Mafia eroding. The brotherhood he had dedicated his life to was rotting from within. Loyalty was no longer sacred. Deals were made in rooms filled with wiretaps and cowardice. But he never let that grief show. When a longtime soldier turned informant in the early 80s, Dellacroce didn't raise his voice. He called in the man's closest friend, handed him a slip of paper with a name and address, and said, "Make it clean." The next day, the informant's body was found in a hotel shower, throat slit so cleanly it looked surgical. No blood on the floor, no shell casings, no sign of struggle, just one message, loud and clear: Omerta still lived. And yet, the walls were closing in. Federal pressure was mounting. Surveillance tech had grown smarter. Prosecutors were hungrier. They didn't just want arrests, they wanted stories. And for the first time in decades, Dellacroce began to feel time pressing down on him. The world he had built, defended, and protected was shifting under his feet. He remained devout, but the ground was no longer solid. Behind the scenes, a storm was brewing. John Gotti was rising fast, too fast. His ambition was volcanic, his charm irresistible. He laughed in front of reporters, wore silk-like armor. Crowds adored him, and cameras loved him back. To the street, he looked like the future. But to Dellacroce, he looked like the end. Still, Dellacroce did not interfere. Not yet. He believed in hierarchy, in tradition. And as long as Paul Castellano was boss, Dellacroce would remain loyal. But that loyalty came at a cost. He saw Gotti building his own faction, his own ideology. A new kind of Cosa Nostra, where silence wasn't sacred, celebrity was. The contradiction ate at him. He never said it aloud, but those close to him noticed the change. His health began to decline. His walks grew slower. His stare lingered longer. He spent more time alone in the rave night backroom, flipping through rosary beads with the same methodical calm he used to order hits. He felt like a man watching his religion die. And yet, he never stopped enforcing the code. Even when the world screamed around him, Dellacroce whispered the same sermon, "Talk, and you die." It wasn't revenge. It wasn't rage. It was preservation. The Mafia couldn't survive without silence. And neither could he. The final days of his life felt like an echo chamber. Old rituals, old rules, old fears. He had outlived many of his enemies, but he hadn't escaped the future. He knew something was coming. A break, a betrayal, a bloodbath. He could feel it in the bones that ached from a lifetime of carrying secrets. In his last meetings with Gotti, there was tension. Dellacroce spoke softly. Gotti listened, but his eyes burned with rebellion. The monk and the prince. One bound by sacred law, the other ready to rewrite it. And somewhere, in the space between them, a fuse had been lit. The code Dellacroce had defended for 5 decades would soon be tested like never before. And in the silence he loved so deeply, the echoes of war were beginning to grow louder. But Dellacroce would not live to see the explosion. Not all of it. That would fall to the men who once worshipped him. And one of them would break the very oath Dellacroce died to protect. Chapter 10. The Two Sides of the Family. It was a quiet dinner, but the tension at the table could have shattered glass. In a dimly lit back room of a Manhattan steakhouse, 2 capos sat across from each other, both loyal to the same empire, yet belonging to entirely different worlds. One wore a pinky ring and a cheap tracksuit, smelling faintly of cologne and cigar smoke. The other had on a custom Italian suit, with a Rolex glinting from beneath his cuff. They exchanged pleasantries, forced smiles, clinked glasses. But beneath the table, their knees never stopped bouncing. Each one knew this family was splitting at the seams. By the early 1980s, the Gambino crime family, once the envy of La Cosa Nostra, was a house divided. At the top, 2 men shared power, Paul Castellano and Aniello Dellacroce. Officially, Castellano was boss, chosen by Carlo Gambino before the old man died in '76. Dellacroce was the underboss, the number 2, the man who enforced order from the street. But unofficially, things were never so clean. Dellacroce had never wanted the crown, not because he feared it, but because he understood its weight. He believed in the old ways, loyalty, respect, blood oaths. He saw the Mafia not as a business, but as a way of life, a secret brotherhood bound by silence. Castellano, on the other hand, saw it all differently. To him, organized crime was just that, organized. It was a corporate ladder built on white-collar scams, construction bids, and political favors. He stayed off the street, hid behind manicured hedges in his Staten Island mansion, and played the part of a businessman. His soldiers called him the Pope behind his back, but there was no reverence in it, only distance. That distance grew wider with every year. Dellacroce guys were the lifeblood of the family's muscle. They worked the neighborhoods, ran the gambling parlors, did the collections, and, when needed, carried out the hits. These were men who'd earned their bones the hard way, with fists and bullets. And they saw Castellano's white-collar world as soft. In their eyes, he was too detached, too clean. Too greedy. Worse, he didn't respect the rules. When it came to the street guys, he gave them scraps. He believed they brought heat, risked indictments. Dellacroce, meanwhile, protected them like a priest guarding his parish. The ideological rift was no longer just philosophical. It was personal, and it was growing dangerous. In the shadows, conversations began. Not formal conspiracies, just whispers. Over drinks. On stoops. In the backs of social clubs where the walls reeked of sweat and cheap whiskey. Soldiers would mutter, "Why should Castellano be boss? Neil's the one we fear. Neil's the one we trust." Neil was Dellacroce's nickname. To them, he was more than underboss. He was a father figure. A monk in the dark, guarding their code. But Dellacroce would never break that code himself. Even if he disagreed with Castellano, even if he saw the arrogance, the disrespect, he kept the peace. Because loyalty, to him, meant sacrifice. Even when it hurt. Even when it bled. Still, there was no denying it. The family was living two separate lives. On the south side of Brooklyn, John Gotti and his crew were running hijackings, loan sharking, and extortion rackets. They were tough, loud, and deeply loyal to Dellacroce. They made no secret of their contempt for Castellano. But as long as Dellacroce was breathing, they kept their heads down. He was the dam holding back a flood. Meanwhile, Castellano surrounded himself with businessmen and white-collar capos. He forged alliances with construction companies, politicians, and union bosses. He rarely showed up to wakes or weddings, and he kept his hands clean. To him, murder was bad for business. Blood in the street meant headlines. Headlines meant investigations. But the real split, the fault line, ran deeper than methods. It was about respect. Castellano began demanding larger cuts from the street crews. He wanted to tax their rackets more heavily, claiming he was bringing more money in through legitimate contracts. To the street guys, it was robbery. They were risking prison every day, scraping together envelopes full of dirty cash, while Castellano sat in his mansion eating veal and reading profit sheets. Behind closed doors, resentment thickened. But Dellacroce kept the lid on. He would tell his guys, "Paulie's the boss. That's it. We don't question it. We don't talk about it." And when Gotti or DeCicco pressed too hard, he would shut it down with a stare that froze blood. Dellacroce's word was law. Even Castellano, with all his power, feared what might happen if Neil turned his back. But Neil never did. Because he knew, if the Gambino family erupted into civil war, the feds wouldn't even have to try. The whole house would burn. Then came the turning point. In 1983, a minor member of Gotti's crew was caught selling heroin. It wasn't the drugs themselves that caused the problem. It was the rule they violated. Castellano had made it crystal clear, no one in the family was to deal heroin. He feared the heat it would bring. Not just arrests, but life sentences, death penalties, RICO charges. To Castellano, heroin wasn't just dangerous, it was the beginning of the end. When he found out about the sale, he exploded. He wanted names. He wanted punishment. He wanted Gotti himself to be held responsible. But Dellacroce refused. He stood up for Gotti, not because he condoned the heroin, but because he knew what Castellano was really doing. He wasn't protecting the family. He was using the rules as a weapon, a pretext, an excuse to cut down anyone who posed a threat to his power. Still, Dellacroce never wavered publicly. He walked a razor's edge, trying to keep peace between two worlds that had already declared quiet war. In private, his heart was breaking. He saw what was coming, saw the ambition in Gotti's eyes, the resentment, the hunger. He saw the contempt Castellano showed for the men who bled for this family. Dellacroce was an old soldier. He knew what happened when kings forgot the cost of loyalty. And yet, he refused to take sides. Because to do so would be to destroy everything. The deeper the divide, the more fragile the truce became. The family was like a loaded gun lying on a table, safe, as long as no one reached for it. But the tension was unbearable. Inside the Rave Night Social Club, Gotti would slam his fist into the table and mutter about Castellano this and Paulie that. His crew would nod, grumble, egg him on. But whenever Dellacroce walked in, the room fell quiet. Like a priest entering confession. No one disrespected him. No one dared. Even Castellano, In his ivory tower, new Dellacroce was the only thing keeping him safe. But Dellacroce was dying. The cancer in his lungs was spreading. He hid it from most, coughed blood into tissues when no one was looking, still wore his suit, still showed up to meetings. But his steps grew slower and his eyes darker. He knew what would happen the moment he was gone. He told a close friend one night, "When I go, there's going to be trouble. Mark my words. A storm's coming." That storm was already forming. Quiet, patient, hungry. As Dellacroce's body weakened, Castellano made a fatal mistake. Instead of drawing closer to the street guys, he distanced himself further. He built a new mansion in Toad Hill, shut out the old crews, and surrounded himself with yes-men in silk ties. He began talking succession. Rumors spread that he planned to name his driver and bodyguard, Thomas Bellotti, as underboss. To the street guys, that was blasphemy. Bellotti wasn't respected. He was seen as a thug, brutal, but dim. Promoting him meant one thing. Castellano had no intention of honoring the legacy Dellacroce built. He was choosing loyalty to himself over loyalty to the family. Gotti was enraged. He felt passed over, disrespected, disposable. And yet, he waited. Because Dellacroce was still alive. But barely. By the end of 1985, Dellacroce was confined to his home. The man who had once ruled the street with a stare now lay in bed, coughing blood, staring out the window. His mind was still sharp, but his body was betraying him. He kept the TV low, the curtains drawn. Visitors came and went. Some cried. Some begged him to name a successor. To give them permission. He never did. Because even in death, Dellacroce believed in the code. But the code was breaking. And when his heart finally stopped on a cold night in early December, the Gambino family didn't just lose a leader. It lost its last restraint. The funeral was massive. Hundreds came. Men in long coats, with solemn faces and damp eyes. They spoke in hushed voices. Gotti stood near the casket, stone-faced. Castellano didn't show. Not once. And in that moment, something snapped. The dam had cracked. The street guys looked at each other, and they saw it clearly. The old man was gone. There was nothing holding them back now. And blood was coming. Chapter 11. The crown goes to Castellano. The air was heavy in Brooklyn that day, not just with the weight of heat, but with something unspoken, an omen. The year was 1976, and for those who lived by the code, it felt like the end of an era was crawling in. Carlo Gambino, the quiet puppeteer who had ruled America's most powerful mafia family from the shadows, was dying. But even as his heart weakened, his grip on the underworld remained unshakably firm, until the very last breath. In the final weeks of his life, Gambino didn't scream for mercy or fight against the inevitable. He moved like a man already at peace with the next world. He wasn't afraid of death. He had outlived bullets, betrayals, and federal indictments. But what troubled him, what weighed on his sleepless nights, was what would come after. Not for his soul, but for his empire. In a modest home in Massapequa, Long Island, under the soft buzz of an old fan, Gambino summoned his inner circle for one last chess move. The family waited with bated breath for the coronation of Aniello Dellacroce. After all, Dellacroce had been his underboss for decades, his wartime consigliere, the man who kept the street muscle loyal and the family's foundation solid. But Carlo, ever the strategist, saw a different future. He didn't crown the warrior. He crowned the accountant. Paul Castellano, Big Paul, was chosen to wear the crown. The news echoed through the underworld like a gunshot in a church. To some, it was blasphemy. Dellacroce heard it directly from Gambino himself. No meeting, no vote, no discussion, just a quiet, deliberate statement, like a judge reading a sentence. Paul would be boss. It wasn't a request. It was the final wish of a dying king. He could have reacted with rage. He had every right. On the streets, he was beloved, feared, respected. He was the one who had bled for the family, not Castellano. Yet Dellacroce didn't flinch. He listened. He nodded. He honored the boss's word. In his world, loyalty wasn't situational. It was sacred. But inside, something shifted. Gambino died quietly on October 15, 1976, succumbing to a heart attack. There was no grand funeral with limousines and floral mountains. The send-off was modest by design. Carlo had never liked attention. Even in death, he refused to give it power. But his final decision would haunt the family for years to come. At the wake, men wept behind dark glasses. Not just for Gambino, but for what they feared was coming. The unity he had enforced with iron whispers was already cracking. The fault line ran deep, through the very heart of the family. Castellano took over like a CEO stepping into a boardroom. He moved into a plush mansion in Tote Hill, Staten Island, far from the grit and grime of the street. His new headquarters didn't smell like blood and bourbon. It smelled like manicured lawns and imported marble. His crew? Accountants, contractors, union leaders in silk ties. He wasn't running rackets anymore. He was running portfolios. Dellacroce, meanwhile, stayed rooted in the shadows. His headquarters was the Rave Night Social Club on Mulberry Street, a place where loyalty wasn't bought with profit margins. It was earned in alleys, in whispered vows, and in shared time behind bars. His men called him father behind his back, the silent monk, the last of the old guard. And yet, he never challenged Paul. Not once. He could have. His side of the family had more soldiers, more earners, more killers. But Dellacroce didn't believe in civil war, not among Cosa Nostra. To him, unity was life. Division was death. Still, Paul knew he had a problem. He had the crown, but he didn't have the love. So he made a deal, a compromise to keep the house from collapsing. Dellacroce would remain underboss. He would have full control of his wing of the family. The street guys, the tough guys, the earners, they would report to him. Castellano would run the top floor, Dellacroce the basement. It was a peace treaty written in cigar smoke and unspoken rules. For a while, it worked. But those close to Dellacroce noticed the wear. He aged faster, smoked more, spoke less. There were nights when he'd sit in the rave night long after the lights dimmed, staring at the door as if waiting for someone who would never come. The betrayal wasn't in the act. It was in the message. He had lived by the sword, and now, the family was being handed to a man who had never dirted his hands. Still, Dellacroce held the line. He told his men, "We follow the boss. No questions, no moves. We do what we're told." And they did, because they feared him and because they loved him. But even loyalty has its limits when respect fades. Beneath the surface, resentment simmered like a pot left too long on the stove. Castellano's men were building construction scams and healthcare rackets, living like businessmen in a mob fantasy. They wore Rolex watches and bragged about their stock portfolios. Dellacroce's crew dealt in muscle, gambling, hijacking, protection. Their suits were off the rack, their hands were calloused, and their loyalty came with scars. To them, Castellano wasn't one of them. He didn't walk the walk. He didn't bleed when they bled. He was the boss by bloodline, not by grit. And yet, nothing exploded. Not yet, because Dellacroce wouldn't allow it. Still, there were quiet tremors, hushed conversations over coffee, strange looks at the rave night, unspoken signals between soldiers. Castellano's efforts to modernize the family were seen as weakness, not evolution. His detachment from street affairs made him vulnerable. In the underworld, perception is power. And his was slipping. What kept it all from falling apart was one man, the silent monk with ice in his veins and the weight of the family on his shoulders. Dellacroce. As long as he lived, the peace held. But peace bought in silence is always temporary. Behind closed doors, Paul was growing paranoid. He suspected Dellacroce's crew was undermining him, spying, plotting, maybe even dreaming of war. He began to tighten the reins. Fewer meetings, less transparency, more control. He even considered having some of Dellacroce's guys shelved, banned from earning, pushed to the fringe. It was a dangerous game, and Paul was playing it alone. Dellacroce knew what was happening. He wasn't a fool. He just chose not to act. To him, restraint wasn't weakness, it was discipline. And discipline, he believed, was what separated men from animals. But there was one thing he couldn't control: time. By the early 1980s, his health was failing. Cancer, a slow, creeping thief. It didn't announce itself with drama. It just stole pieces of him, day by day. First his appetite. then his voice, then his strength. He kept coming to the rave night, even when the pain made his hands shake. He greeted his men with the same cold nod. But behind the eyes, the fire was dimming. The family knew. They saw it. They felt it. And with each passing day, a terrible question began to rise. What happens when the monk is gone? The answer, they feared, was chaos. Dellacroce didn't speak of death. Not directly. But there was a moment, quiet, unrecorded, remembered only by those who were there, when he pulled one of his closest captains aside. In a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Keep them in line. No matter what. Don't let this place burn." That was his final command. Not of power, of protection. But it was already too late. The cracks were showing. Castellano's leadership had become a joke in some circles. He refused to attend wakes for made men. He acted like a king, not a boss. And in the shadows, a young wolf was watching. His name? John Gotti. A street guy? A Dellacroce guy? And he had no intention of bowing forever. The stage was being set. Quietly. Fatally. And all that held the storm back was a dying man in a dark overcoat, sitting in the back of a social club, lighting one last cigarette with trembling hands. The end wasn't here yet, but it was close enough to smell. And when it came, it wouldn't be quiet. It would roar. Chapter 12, Quiet Dom, the Peacemaker. The room was thick with tension, too quiet, too still. Somewhere in the shadows of the Rave Night social club, a storm was brewing. Whispers floated through the smoke like ghosts. It's coming. But the one man who could stop it sat in silence, eyes closed, face unreadable. Aniello Dellacroce, the silent monk of the Gambinos, was listening to the sound beneath the noise, the heartbeat of a family on the edge of civil war. Paul Castellano sat in the gilded chair, boss in title, but king without a kingdom. The streets didn't respect him. Not the way they had Carlo. And certainly not the way they revered Dellacroce. Big Paul's palace on Toad Hill was a world away from the grime and loyalty of the city's underbelly. He surrounded himself with accountants, lawyers, and businessmen who wore silk suits and never got their hands dirty. But down in the trenches, it was men like John Gotti who still carried the scars of the old ways, brash, bloody, and streetborn. Gotti wasn't just ambitious. He was volcanic. Underneath the tailored coats and wise guy charm, there was fire in his chest. And that fire was beginning to lick at the heels of Castellano's regime. Word on the street was that Gotti and the Bergen crew were sharpening their knives. The disrespect had grown too loud. Castellano had been avoiding the street guys like a plague, treating them like relics instead of soldiers. And the more he distanced himself, the closer they moved toward betrayal. Dellacroce could feel it like a sickness in the air. The Gambino family was splitting in two, one side suited, polished, corporate. The other, calloused, violent, loyal to the code. But he also knew something that neither side fully understood. Once blood spills between brothers, there's no turning back. And so, with his voice barely above a whisper, Aniello stepped into the void, not as an enforcer, not even as an underboss, but as a peacemaker. He called Gotti in, alone, away from the others. There were no threats, no shouting. Just two men, a pot of black coffee, and a single hard truth hanging in the room like smoke. "You make a move now," Dellacroce told him, "and everything we built goes up in flames." Gotti paced like a caged animal, fists clenched, nostrils flared. But he listened. Because if Carlo Gambino was the mind, and Castellano the hand, then Dellacroce was the soul of the family. It wasn't the first time Dellacroce had defused a powder keg. His entire career had been a study in restraint. Violence when necessary, silence when not. He believed in omerta not just as a rule, but as a religion. But now he was playing a different kind of game, balancing the egos of two empires under one roof. It was like standing on a frozen lake, listening for cracks, trying not to breathe too hard. He started making quiet visits to crews in Queens and Brooklyn, not to issue commands, but to listen. The old-timers respected him. The young guns feared him. But most importantly, they trusted him. And trust, in Cosa Nostra, is more valuable than money, more rare than loyalty. Dellacroce used that trust like currency, calming tempers, cooling ambition, reminding men that patience wasn't weakness, it was survival. But Paul Castellano didn't see it. Or worse, he didn't care. To him, Dellacroce was a buffer, a relic from another time. He didn't understand that the only thing standing between him and a bullet was the quiet man who sat across from him at family meetings, nodding, absorbing, never fully agreeing. Castellano thought his money could buy respect. But in the Mafia, respect isn't bought. It's bled for. And Paul had never bled. Still, Dellacroce held the line. Even as Castellano grew more arrogant, more dismissive of the street guys, Aniello kept the lid on the boiling pot. He gave Gotti just enough leash to feel heard, but not enough to hang the family. He reminded the crews what was at stake, not just money, but legacy. Carlo's legacy. Their legacy. Behind the scenes, he played chess while the others played checkers. He aligned certain captains, shuffled others, made subtle moves that kept the balance just long enough to maintain a fragile peace. He wasn't naive. He knew this couldn't last forever. But every week he bought was a week without blood on the streets. And that, in his eyes, was worth more than all the rackets in the world. There were moments when the facade almost cracked. Like the night Gotti's brother, Gene, was insulted at a sit-down by one of Castellano's guys. The tension in the room was electric. Chairs scraped, hands twitched near holsters. But before anything could ignite, Dellacroce's voice cut through the noise like a blade. "We settle this like men, not animals." The room fell silent. The fire cooled, and the night passed without gunfire. But even the strongest dam can only hold back a flood for so long. Dellacroce was getting older. The years of smoke, stress, and silence were catching up with him. He looked gaunt, pale, like a ghost in a trench coat. And though he never said it out loud, he knew his time was running out. The family could feel it too. And with every cough, every wince, every unsteady step, the question loomed larger. What happens when the peacemaker is gone? Some nights he sat alone in his Staten Island home, staring at the wall, thinking about Carlo, about the promise they made, to keep the family strong, united, feared. He wondered if they'd made a mistake, if letting Castellano take the throne had cursed them all. But there was no going back. Not now. All he could do was delay the inevitable. The irony wasn't lost on him. For decades, he'd been a man of violence, a button man, a killer, a ghost in the night. And yet here he was, trying to broker peace between men he once would have clipped without a second thought. Maybe it was age. Maybe it was wisdom. Or maybe he just wanted to leave something behind that wasn't soaked in blood. Even his enemies had to admit, Dellacroce's words still meant something. In a world full of liars and backstabbers, his silence had become a kind of truth. But truth alone doesn't stop bullets. And though he'd kept the wolves at bay, he could feel them circling closer. Gotti's eyes had changed, sharper, hungrier, and Castellano had become more isolated, more paranoid, as if he sensed the throne beneath him was made of ice. Still, Dellacroce moved like a ghost between them, never fully choosing a side, yet protecting both. It was a dangerous game, but one he played with a steady hand. Because in the end, he believed the Gambino family could survive anything, as long as it didn't turn on itself. But deep down, in the quiet hours before dawn, he knew the truth. He wasn't preventing a war. He was postponing it. And when he was gone, there'd be no one left to hold back the tide. That truth haunted him, not out of fear for himself, but for the family, for what they'd built, for what they'd become. He had once believed in honor, in rules, in the old ways. But now, watching the cracks widen beneath his feet, he wondered if those beliefs had become his own prison. On a cold night in late autumn, Dellacroce stood at his window, watching the streetlights flicker through the rain. He looked older than his years, his breath shallow, his eyes heavy. Somewhere, not far away, Gotti was meeting with his crew, and Castellano was dining in silence behind his high Staten Island walls. Two kings, one crown, and the only man keeping them from tearing each other apart was fading like smoke in the wind. The war hadn't started yet, but the fuse had been lit, and Aniello Dellacroce was running out of time. Chapter 13. The protégé, John Gotti. The room was quiet, too quiet for men like these. the kind of silence that thickened the air like fog off the East River. Dellacroce sat at the edge of the table, his posture still and unreadable, as if carved from the same stone that lined old Sicilian churches. Across from him sat a man who was anything but quiet. John Gotti, charisma wrapped in a sharkskin suit, swagger in the form of a smirk. He didn't speak first, he was smart enough not to. But his eyes, they talked plenty. "You want the world," Dellacroce finally said, voice low but cutting. "But you'll drown in it if you don't learn to swim like a shadow." Gotti blinked, not in confusion. He understood the metaphor. He just didn't agree with it. But this wasn't the time to challenge the man known as Father O'Neill, the underboss who wore silence like a crown and ruled with presence alone. It had started years earlier, when Gotti was just muscle for the Bergen crew out in Queens. A tough kid with a hot temper and a mouth that couldn't sit still. But what caught Dellacroce's attention wasn't the noise, it was the loyalty. The fierce, unwavering kind. Like a wolf that picked one master and would die at his feet before ever switching sides. Dellacroce saw in Gotti what few did, potential. But not just as a killer. As a leader. As something greater. If only he could learn restraint. And that was the catch. Teaching a wildfire to smolder instead of blaze was no easy feat still. Dellacroce tried. God knows he tried. In the back rooms of rave night and in parked cars that never stopped running. Aniello spoke to John in a language few others could decipher. It wasn't just orders, it was philosophy. "Don't let them see you coming," he'd whisper. "Don't let them hear your name in the papers unless it's your obituary." It was a code born from decades in the shadows. From blood spilled quietly and power held without spectacle. But Gotti wasn't built like that. He admired Dellacroce, revered him, even, but he wanted to leave his mark in red ink, not pencil. He wanted the spotlight, the suits, the street legends. Dellacroce tried to curb it, keeping him close, almost like a father would with a son who reminded him too much of himself in his younger, more dangerous years. Their bond was real, genuine. Dellacroce didn't trust many. But with Gotti, there was something deeper than trust. It was hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, he could mold this wildfire into a torch. A guiding light, not a blaze of destruction. But the streets talk. Always. And Dellacroce was no fool. He heard the whispers. About Gotti taking scores without kicking up the right percentage. About late-night meetings with guys whose faces he didn't recognize from the books. About Paul Castellano's quiet unease. And he knew what was coming if Gotti didn't slow down. "John," he'd say, lighting another cigarette with the same hand that once pulled a trigger without hesitation. "When you burn too bright, you blind the people standing behind you. Makes 'em start thinking you ain't looking out for them. Makes 'em nervous." Gotti would nod. Always respectful. But the grin stayed. That damned grin. Dellacroce wasn't angry, he was worried. Not for himself. His legacy was written in stone, in prison walls and unmarked graves. But Gotti? He still had time. If only he could learn that power isn't about being feared. It's about being obeyed. And obedience don't come from noise. It comes from presence. There were moments, brief, flickering moments, when Dellacroce thought he was getting through. Like when Gotti took a step back after the feds got too close. Or when he handled a beef with words instead of bullets. But those moments never lasted. The pull of the spotlight was too strong. Still, Dellacroce never turned his back. Never scolded him in front of others. That wasn't his way. Instead, he kept his mentorship private, sacred. Like a confession whispered through a screen. In a world built on betrayal, Dellacroce never betrayed Gotti. Not even once. Others in the family weren't so patient. They saw Gotti as a liability. A spark near a powder keg. But they couldn't act. Not with Dellacroce shielding him like a lion protecting his cub. The old man's name still carried too much weight. His silence louder than most men's screams. And Gotti? He knew it. Knew who kept him alive when the whispers got too loud. That's why he visited Dellacroce more than anyone else. That's why he'd sit for hours in silence, listening, absorbing, pretending he could tame the fire inside. Dellacroce never gave up on him. But the cracks were showing. He once confided, in a rare moment of weariness, "I can't protect a man from himself, no matter how much I want to." The words hung in the air like smoke. Regret laced through every syllable. Because Dellacroce wasn't just preparing Gotti for leadership, he was preparing him for survival. And he wasn't sure the kid would make it. When Castellano began tightening his grip, Gotti's resentment grew. And Dellacroce tried to mediate, keep the peace. But peace only works when both sides want it. Gotti wanted power. Castellano wanted obedience. And Dellacroce? He just wanted to avoid war. But war was coming. One night, after a sit-down that ended with raised voices and clenched fists, Dellacroce pulled Gotti aside and spoke in the firmest tone he'd ever used with him. "You make a move on Paul," he said slowly. "You're not just taking on a boss. You're cutting the head off a family with no plan for what comes next. That ain't honor, John. That's suicide." For the first time, Gotti looked shaken. Not scared. He didn't do scared. But shaken. Because when Dellacroce spoke like that, it wasn't a warning. It was prophecy. And yet, even then, Dellacroce knew it might not be enough. Gotti's ambition wasn't just a trait. It was a hunger. The kind that eats a man from the inside out if he doesn't feed it. Still, he kept trying. Until the very end, Dellacroce believed in him. Or maybe he just couldn't face the idea that the boy he mentored, the one he pulled from the chaos and molded into something resembling control, could be the spark that burned the house down. When Dellacroce looked at Gotti, he didn't see a future boss. He saw a crossroads. One path led to glory through discipline. The other ended in blood. But you can only lead a man to the edge of wisdom. You can't make him drink from it. The final time they met, just weeks before Dellacroce would fall ill, there was a stillness between them. Not awkward, not cold, just different. Like they both knew the window was closing. Dellacroce leaned in and said, barely above a whisper, "Don't forget where you came from, John. Don't let the noise drown the message." Gotti said nothing, just nodded. The same nod he always gave. But this time, there was no grin. Dellacroce watched him walk out, his long shadow trailing behind him like a question mark. And that was the last time they'd speak. The mentor would soon be gone. And the protege? He was already writing his own chapter, in ink too bold to erase. But as the streets buzzed and alliances shifted, one truth loomed over everything like a storm cloud. When the man who kept the wolves at bay is no longer there, who keeps the wolves from turning on each other? And more importantly, who stops the fire from spreading when the last one holding the water is gone? Chapter 14, Surveillance and Suspicion. By the early 1980s, federal law enforcement had begun shifting its focus away from the flamboyant John Gotti and toward the elusive figure who many believed was the true power behind the Gambino throne, Aniello Dellacroce. Operating with monk-like discipline, Dellacroce remained a phantom to investigators. He rarely used telephones, held meetings in whispered tones, and avoided public displays of power. But despite his efforts, the FBI had not forgotten about him. To the Bureau, Dellacroce was the key to unlocking the inner workings of the Gambino family. They just needed proof. The Rave Night Social Club on Mulberry Street, Dellacroce's spiritual headquarters, became ground zero for the Bureau's surveillance operations. Hidden bugs were installed in the club, and surveillance vans became a constant presence in the neighborhood. Agents observed a rotating cast of mob figures coming and going, from capos to soldiers to ambitious young upstarts like Gotti. Still, the Bureau's frustration mounted. Dellacroce was cautious to a fault. He conducted business through intermediaries, never discussed illegal activities on tape, and spoke in cryptic, coded language. In an era where many mobsters had grown careless, Dellacroce remained an enigma. Agents listening to hours of tape often heard little more than Dellacroce offering philosophical musings about loyalty, discipline, and omerta. He gave advice to younger men, but never incriminated himself. Unlike Gotti, who relished attention, Dellacroce was allergic to the spotlight. He still dressed in simple dark suits, showed little emotion, and moved with the silence of a ghost. The FBI, despite having their wiretaps in place, couldn't pin him down. Nevertheless, the mounting surveillance pressure put Dellacroce under increasing strain. His health was deteriorating. Years of stress, combined with a lifetime of chain smoking, had taken its toll. But even as cancer began to eat away at him, Dellacroce remained stoic. He never wavered in his role as underboss and consigliere in spirit. He believed it was his duty to keep the family together, especially as tension between the Castellano faction and the street crews simmered dangerously. In hushed tones inside the rave night, he warned his protégés, especially Gotti, to remain calm, to bide their time, and to let things play out. He knew the streets were talking, and he knew rebellion was in the air. But as always, Dellacroce believed in patience. He didn't fear the FBI. He feared the Mafia unraveling from within. And so, even as federal agents surrounded him with microphones and watched his every move, Aniello Dellacroce remained the silent monk, calm, cold, and unbroken. Chapter 15, A Terminal Secret. By the early 1980s, Aniello Dellacroce was no longer the imposing enforcer who once struck fear into enemies with a mere glance. Age had crept up on him, but something even more insidious was eating away at the man known as the Silent Monk. Dellacroce had been diagnosed with terminal cancer, a secret he kept from nearly everyone outside his closest circle. Despite the toll it took on his body, he continued to show up at the Rave Night Social Club, his presence alone enough to command order and respect within the Gambino ranks. Privately, Dellacroce knew his time was running out. The cancer was aggressive, and treatments were minimal. But he refused to appear weak or vulnerable, especially not while the family teetered on the edge of an internal war. Paul Castellano's leadership was drawing increasing resentment from the street crews, particularly from John Gotti's faction, who viewed Castellano as detached and too business-minded. Dellacroce, ever the disciplinarian and old-school mafioso, worked tirelessly to suppress the growing discontent. He believed that as long as he was alive, he could prevent an all-out civil war. Even in his weakened state, Dellacroce held court like a monarch in decline, frail but wise. He called private meetings with key lieutenants, urging restraint, preaching unity, and reminding them of the old ways: loyalty, discipline, omerta. He warned Gotti not to act impulsively, not to take what he wanted by force. Gotti listened, out of respect, out of love, but the fire in his belly was growing. Dellacroce could see it, and it troubled him. He never told Gotti how sick he truly was. To reveal such a truth would be to signal weakness, and weakness in the Mafia was an invitation for chaos. Only a few, including his daughter and a handful of trusted associates, knew how far the disease had progressed. Toward the end, Dellacroce grew quieter than usual, retreating to his Staten Island home more frequently, yet still making occasional appearances at the rave night to project strength. In those final months, Dellacroce wasn't just battling cancer, he was battling time. He knew the fragile peace between Castellano and Gotti hinged on his continued existence. He knew that when he died, the delicate balance would collapse. His death would be a fuse, and the explosion would follow. But still, he held on, as long as he could, hoping to buy the family just a little more time. In November 1985, Aniello Dellacroce passed away quietly. His death was not only the end of a life, but the end of an era. The Gambino family's silent protector was gone, and with him, the last barrier between Paul Castellano and the storm gathering around him vanished. Chapter 16, The Silent Monk Dies, 1985. On November 2nd, 1985, Aniello Dellacroce, the feared underboss, the loyal soldier, the silent guardian of the Gambino crime family, died of cancer at the age of 71. It was the end of an era. For years, he had been the calming force that kept the volatile factions within the family from exploding into outright war. His death sent a tremor through the underworld. Known for his stoic presence and absolute discipline, Dellacroce's passing wasn't just a personal loss. It was a tectonic shift in the delicate balance of power that had held the Gambino family together since Carlo Gambino's passing. Dellacroce died at his home on Staten Island, surrounded by close family members. His illness had been kept hidden from most, known only to a select few. Even in his final months, he had refused to show weakness or relinquish control. Those who visited him in his final days recalled a man still sharp in mind, still protective of the family's stability, and still warning against reckless ambition. He never spoke openly about his regrets or misgivings. True to his nickname, the Silent Monk, he kept his thoughts close and his counsel even closer. Within hours of his death, word rippled through the Gambino ranks, and just as quickly, through law enforcement and rival families. The reaction was solemn but ominous. Dellacroce had served as a bridge between the blue-collar street crews loyal to him and the white-collar faction led by Paul Castellano. With that bridge gone, the simmering discontent among men like John Gotti was no longer contained. Castellano, already viewed with suspicion and resentment, was now exposed. Dellacroce had been the only thing keeping him safe from a rebellion. Now, the shield was gone. At the Ravenite Social Club, the mood was tense. There was grief, certainly, but beneath it, something darker. Gotti and his crew, who had once bowed in deference to Dellacroce's restraint, now saw an open path forward. The old codes were slipping, and ambition was rising. Dellacroce's death was not just the end of a man. It was the final crack in the dam, the moment the Gambino family began to spiral toward a violent reckoning. The monk was gone, and chaos was coming. Chapter 17, A Final Disrespect. Aniello Dellacroce had been the binding force between two very different halves of the Gambino crime family. His quiet strength, his unwavering loyalty, and his austere code of Cosa Nostra honor made him the last of a dying breed. So when he passed away on November 2nd, 1985, the entire family should have stopped to mourn. But one man did not. Paul Castellano, the man who owed his throne to Gambino's controversial decision to bypass Dellacroce, chose not to attend the wake or the funeral of his underboss. He cited concerns over FBI surveillance and a desire to avoid drawing attention to himself. But in the eyes of Dellacroce loyalists, especially John Gotti and the street crews, it was something far worse, an unforgivable insult. For Gotti, this was not just a slight, it was the final straw. Dellacroce had acted as a buffer, a dam holding back a tidal wave of resentment and fury within the ranks. Without him, the street guys were left to deal with Castellano's increasingly detached leadership and perceived greed. Castellano had alienated the rank and file, focusing more on white-collar rackets and treating the street crews like a liability. But skipping the funeral of Dellacroce, a man revered for his old-school values and selfless service, was seen as a betrayal of everything the Mafia stood for. Among Gotti and his inner circle, including Frank DeCicco and Angelo Ruggiero, a shift took place. The planning began, quiet at first, but quickly gaining steam. Castellano had shown his hand. He had proven that he neither respected the man who held the family together nor understood the meaning of omerta. If Dellacroce's death had left a vacuum, Castellano's absence at the funeral filled it with rage. Gotti no longer had to convince others to follow his lead. The disrespect had done that for him. The road to murder had begun, paved not with ambition, but with insult. The boss had failed to honor the silent monk, and now he would pay the price. Chapter 18, Death Sentence Signed. Aniello Dellacroce had once been the last dam holding back a tidal wave. As long as he lived, his word was law, even to the likes of John Gotti. Dellacroce's final request had been explicit. There would be no move against Paul Castellano while he was still alive. It was a code of honor rooted in loyalty, tradition, and a desire to avoid internal bloodshed. But with his death in November 1985, that fragile truce unraveled almost immediately. Gotti and his faction, already simmering with resentment, saw Castellano's blatant absence from Dellacroce's wake and funeral as a public betrayal, a final act of disrespect to a man who had given his life to the family. To them, it was more than poor judgment. It was an unforgivable insult. Castellano had not just ignored a long-serving underboss. He had spat on the memory of the only man who could have saved him. In the days following Dellacroce's funeral, whispered conversations turned into war plans. The insult was the justification they'd been waiting for. Gotti and his inner circle, including Frank DeCicco, Angelo Ruggiero, and Sammy Gravano, convened in secret, convinced that Castellano had to die. The streets were already rumbling with discontent. Castellano's greed, aloof leadership, and growing legal troubles had eroded his authority. Now, with Dellacroce gone, there was no longer a reason to hold back. Gotti didn't make the decision lightly. He had grown under Dellacroce's wing, learning patience, discipline, and the value of waiting for the right moment. But he also understood power, how quickly it slipped away when not seized. The insult at the funeral was symbolic, a message that Castellano saw himself as above the street guys, above Dellacroce's legacy, and above the rules. In his own mind, Gotti believed he was honoring Dellacroce's legacy by removing a boss who had betrayed everything Dellacroce stood for. And while Dellacroce had sworn Gotti to silence while he lived, he had said nothing about what came after. By December 1985, the die had been cast. Surveillance footage captured meetings, hushed voices in diners and cars, Gotti's movements increasingly elusive. The FBI sensed something coming but didn't know exactly what. Inside the Gambino family, a silent revolution had begun. The code had changed. The loyalty once owed to Castellano died with Dellacroce, and the execution of a boss was now not just possible, but imminent. Chapter 19. Sparks Steakhouse Assassination. December 16, 1985. Manhattan. The city was decked in Christmas lights, the streets alive with holiday shoppers, and the bustle of winter. But on the corner of East 46th Street and 3rd Avenue, as the cold wind rolled through, a darker plan was unfolding, one that would forever alter the power structure of the American Mafia. Paul Castellano, the official boss of the Gambino family, stepped out of a black Lincoln Town car in front of Sparks Steakhouse. He was wearing a long overcoat, his signature wide tie knotted tightly at the neck. Beside him, loyal underboss and driver Tommy Bellotti followed closely, both unaware they were walking into a trap. Castellano wasn't a man accustomed to looking over his shoulder. He believed his title, his reputation, and his connections had insulated him from such vulgar acts as street executions. But the underworld had changed, and John Gotti was its new architect. In the weeks following Aniello Dellacroce's death, Gotti's faction had moved quickly. Castellano's absence from Dellacroce's funeral was seen not just as a personal slight, but as a declaration of war. To the street guys, it was the final proof of Castellano's detachment from the gritty realities of mob life, a sign he cared more about white-collar rackets than honoring the men who earned on the streets. Gotti, once bound by Dellacroce's restraint, was now free to act. And act he would. The planning was precise, military in structure. The hit team included trusted men like Salvatore, Sammy the Bull Gravano, Dominic, Fat Dom, Pitsonia, Edward Lino, and others from the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club. They were stationed in pairs around the block, at vantage points, in parked cars, on foot. Each had a designated target, a task, and a timing window. Gotti and Consigliere Frank DeCicco observed from a car across the street, radioing final instructions, ensuring the moment unfolded like clockwork. As Castellano and Bellotti exited the car, the gunman struck. No words, no warnings, just thunderous gunfire. Castellano fell first, collapsing on the sidewalk in a heap of overcoat and blood. Bellotti attempted to react, but was shot multiple times before he could reach for a weapon. In less than 10 seconds, both men lay dead in the freezing street, their bodies leaking red into the snow-dusted curb. Panic erupted inside the steakhouse. Diners ducked under tables, staff fled toward the kitchen. Within minutes, NYPD had sealed the block. Media swarmed the scene. Photos of Castellano's lifeless body, slumped, face down, next to his car, became instant symbols of the Mafia's internal war. It was the most brazen mob assassination in decades, carried out in Midtown Manhattan at rush hour, just steps from corporate high-rises and Christmas displays. But for Gotti, it was a victory painted in blood. He had removed his obstacle, severed the old world from the new, and claimed the throne through bullets rather than votes. It was a coup d'état, executed with deadly flair and reckless confidence. In the days that followed, law enforcement knew who had orchestrated the hit, but proving it would take years. In the underworld, however, the message was already clear. Gotti was boss now, and he hadn't waited for permission. This assassination would send shockwaves through the five families, reshuffle alliances, and trigger an era of aggressive federal surveillance and prosecutions. But for that brief winter night in 1985, the Gambino family was Gotti's, and he took it the only way he knew how. The age of subtlety had died with Dellacroce. The age of spectacle had just begun. Chapter 20. The Reign of the Dapper Don. With Paul Castellano eliminated in a hail of bullets outside Sparks Steakhouse, a new era for the Gambino family was thrust into motion, loud, brazen, and impossible to ignore. At the helm stood John Gotti, the flashy protege of Aniello Dellacroce, whose reign was as much about spectacle as it was about strategy. Gotti was no backroom boss. He was front-page news. His sharp suits, swaggering gait, and unabashed confidence made him both a darling of the media and a nightmare for law enforcement. The Mafia had a new face, and it wore a smile that dared anyone to knock it off. Where Dellacroce had governed with discretion and old-world discipline, Gotti tore up the rulebook. He moved the family headquarters back to the Rave Night Social Club, the same place the FBI had already bugged. He welcomed visitors and foot soldiers in broad daylight. Under Gotti, the Gambino family began operating with a boldness that drew admiration from the streets and alarm from the feds. His image, part gangster, part celebrity, earned him the nickname the Dapper Don. He made appearances in court like he was attending a red carpet event. Juries were dazzled. Prosecutors were frustrated. And the public, for a time, was enthralled. But beneath the glitz was a simmering undercurrent of discontent. Some of the old guard viewed Gotti's style as dangerous, an invitation for scrutiny and inevitable downfall. Dellacroce had warned against this very thing, counseling Gotti to remain in the shadows, to let others take the spotlight. Now, with Dellacroce gone and Castellano's blood still fresh on the pavement, Gotti's rise symbolized a turning point. The Mafia was no longer just a secret society. Under Gotti, it was a show. He elevated loyalists like Sammy Gravano and Frank Lacasio to high-ranking positions, ensuring his inner circle was fiercely devoted. Meetings were frequent, decisions made swiftly. Gotti's charisma made him a unifying figure for the street crews, but his public presence began to rattle nerves within Cosa Nostra's higher circles. The commission, long committed to discretion and order, washed with increasing unease as the Gambino boss became a national icon. Television crews parked outside courthouses. Reporters lined the sidewalks of Little Italy. Gotti played it up every chance he got. But in doing so, he painted a target on his own back. For the time being, however, the streets belonged to Gotti. His dominance was absolute. The message was clear. Dellacroce's quiet legacy had ended with him, and in its place stood a boss who embraced the spotlight, thrived on power, and believed he could outsmart the system. The reign of the Dapper Don had begun, loud, lethal, and destined for headlines. 21. If Dellacroce had lived. Had Aniello Dellacroce lived beyond November 1985, many believed the course of the Gambino crime family, and indeed, the American Mafia, could have unfolded differently. Dellacroce had long served as a bridge between the old-world code of Cosa Nostra and the younger, more brash generation of mobsters like John Gotti. His unwavering loyalty to Paul Castellano, despite deep ideological differences, kept the family from splintering during turbulent times. Dellacroce's presence alone acted as a restraining force. As Gotti's mentor and moral compass, he had always cautioned restraint, secrecy, and respect for the chain of command. His famous warning, "No move on Paul while I live," was not just about loyalty, but about preserving stability in a world where rash decisions meant bloodshed and federal heat. With Dellacroce alive, many insiders believe Gotti would not have dared challenge Castellano. The threat of civil war within the family would have been contained. More importantly, Dellacroce's old-school values might have kept the Gambinos closer to the shadows, as he had always emphasized. He despised the limelight, and under his guidance, Gotti's thirst for celebrity could have been tempered or redirected. Law enforcement attention, which intensified with Gotti's flamboyance, may have remained at a manageable level under Dellacroce's influence. The unity of the family, already fraying under Castellano's aloof rule and Gotti's rising popularity, might have been preserved with Dellacroce mediating the divide. But Dellacroce's death removed the only figure both factions respected. With him gone, Gotti no longer felt bound by Omerta's traditions or Dellacroce's dying wish. The path to Castellano's murder was cleared. In the end, Dellacroce's legacy became a haunting what-if in Mafia history. Had he lived, perhaps the Gambino family wouldn't have soared so high under Gotti, nor crashed so hard. His death marked not just the loss of a man, but the collapse of an era where silence, loyalty, and fear held more power than headlines. Chapter 22, The FBI's Assessment. They never had a clean shot at him. Not once. Not in over 3 decades of wiretaps, surveillance vans, and sleepless nights spent listening through static. Aniello Dellacroce, Mr. Neil to his underworld associates, remained the FBI's ghost. A man they studied, chased, circled, but could never corner. And that alone made him one of the most respected and quietly feared mob figures to ever breathe the air of New York's underworld. He wasn't like the rest. He didn't swagger into social clubs or pose for front-page photos with silk ties and gold watches. He didn't call attention to himself or speak more than necessary. He moved like smoke, through shadows, down alleyways, in hushed tones behind soundproof doors. And for the Bureau, who specialized in finding patterns, traces, and mistakes, Dellacroce was maddening. Because he didn't leave a trail. One former federal agent, now retired, but still speaking in hushed reverence, once said, "You didn't catch Mr. Neil talking on a bug. You caught silence. Respectful silence. And then you realized that silence had more power than shouting ever could." By the time the FBI fully understood the weight of Dellacroce's presence, it was already too late. He had been a pillar inside the Gambino family for decades, first under Albert Anastasia, then Carlo Gambino, and finally Paul Castellano. But to law enforcement, he was more than a second-in-command. He was the glue that kept chaos from erupting, the one man whose calm presence could hush a room full of murderers, the rare gangster who demanded respect not with noise, but with gravity. What made Dellacroce unique, what made agents both admire and fear him, was that he never broke character, not even for a second. He never grew sloppy, never gave in to greed or vanity. While other mobsters strutted down Mulberry Street like kings, Neil sat quietly in his unassuming home on Staten Island, where the curtains were always drawn and the lawn always trimmed. His life was order, precision, code. He was the kind of man who never walked into a room unless he already knew who was in it, what they wanted, and what they feared. The FBI began profiling Dellacroce seriously in the late 1960s, after Carlo Gambino named him underboss. But their files were thin, remarkably thin for a man so high up. Where Gotti and other younger capos bragged and barked and partied in public, Neil stayed behind the curtain. He didn't drink to excess, didn't gamble wildly, didn't get high. His personal life was like a locked drawer, and not even the Bureau's best efforts could pry it open. They tried bugs. They tried informants. They even leaned on low-level guys in the hope someone might give up something, anything. But all they got was a name whispered in reverence. You don't cross Mr. Neil. Mr. Neil doesn't talk business like that. You want to stay breathing, don't ask questions about Mr. Neil. Agents started to wonder, was he truly clean? Or was he just that good? It became clear over time that it wasn't luck. It was discipline. Dellacroce was the embodiment of Cosa Nostra's original code, Omerta, the vow of silence. Not just in the courtroom, but in every breath he took. He didn't cut deals, didn't flip, and when someone else did, he treated them like ghosts. Vanished names. Betrayal to him wasn't just a sin, it was a death sentence, spiritually if not physically. Even seasoned federal prosecutors would admit, off the record, that they respected him. Not because they sympathized, but because they recognized greatness. In an age where the Mafia was beginning to crumble from within, with rats and renegades eroding its foundation, Dellacroce stood firm like an old cathedral, weathered but unmoved. In meetings, FBI agents often debated how to bring him down. But time and again, they ran into the same wall. He was too smart to talk on the phone, too cautious to meet in the open, too experienced to get emotional. He kept his voice low, his circle small, and his movements tighter than a drum. One surveillance team spent 6 months tailing him and came up with less than a page of usable intel. The man never slipped. He went from home, to church, to dinner, to work, always in silence, always in control. One agent joked that they learned more about Dellacroce dry cleaner than about Dellacroce himself. But it wasn't just his caution. It was his control. The way he kept his men in line. The way he enforced order without threats. He didn't need to raise his voice. A glance from Mr. Neal was enough. That quiet command made FBI analysts sweat. Because they knew, men who inspired fear without ever raising their hand were the most dangerous of all. In the Bureau's files, there was a phrase that came up more than once. True gangster. Not said with admiration, but with reluctant acknowledgement. Dellacroce wasn't in the Mafia for fame or fortune. He believed in the life. Lived it. Breathed it. Upheld its traditions like a monk in a crumbling temple. He was, in many ways, the Mafia's last true believer. One agent recalled intercepting a wiretap on a different Gambino capo, in which Dellacroce's name came up. The men weren't bragging or laughing. They were quiet, talking about how you better do right by Mr. Neal, or he sees everything, even when he's not there. It sent chills through the agents listening, because this wasn't fear born from violence. It was fear born from reverence. Another said, he made you feel like you were being watched even when you weren't, like he had eyes in every room. But there was another reason the Bureau watched Dellacroce so closely. They knew that as long as he was alive, the Mafia had balance. Chaos circled the edges, especially with John Gotti rising like a firecracker, but Neal kept the lid on. Barely. The agents worried that once he was gone, the center wouldn't hold. And they were right. In the early 1980s, the FBI started seeing the cracks. Gotti was getting louder, bolder, making moves that risked exposure. They knew Castellano was unpopular, isolated in his mansion, seen by many as too removed from the street life. Dellacroce was the buffer, the elder, the one man who could whisper in both ears and keep the family from turning on itself. But cancer doesn't wait for peace to arrive. As Dellacroce's health declined, agents began feeling a cold sense of inevitability. They monitored hospitals. They checked every file for signs of a power shift. Because they knew the second Dellacroce's heart stopped beating, war would follow. One agent put it like this: he wasn't just the underboss. He was the dam holding back the flood. And yet, despite decades of effort, the FBI never charged him with a single crime that stuck. No racketeering. No murder. No conspiracy. They had suspicions, of course, mountains of them. But Dellacroce left no fingerprints on anything. His orders, if he gave them, were never recorded. His connections were invisible threads, perfectly woven. In courtrooms across the city, his name was whispered but never shouted. Prosecutors envied him. Defense lawyers studied him. He was, to the Bureau, what a ghostwriter is to a famous book. You don't see him, but you feel his hand on every page. In a strange way, the agents chasing him developed something bordering on respect. Not for what he did, but for how he did it. He lived and died by the code. Never turned. Never cracked. Never tried to bargain with his soul in exchange for freedom. And when he finally died in late 1985, the mood inside the Bureau was oddly somber. They didn't celebrate, because they knew what was coming. With Dellacroce gone, the wolves would tear into each other. The Gambino family would descend into blood and noise. And the man who once kept the shadows calm had taken all the silence with him. At his funeral, federal agents watched from a distance as hundreds lined the streets. Wise guys from every borough. Silent nods. Dark suits. No grand speeches. Just presence. Just wait. A final show of respect for a man who never needed to announce himself. And then, just weeks later, the bomb dropped. Paul Castellano was gunned down outside Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan. Broad daylight. A public execution. Loud. Defiant. Reckless. Everything Dellacroce had spent his life avoiding. The FBI's worst fears were realized. The dam had broken. But even in death, Dellacroce's influence lingered like smoke in a room long after the fire's gone out. His files remained open. His name still haunted the margins of transcripts. And agents, old and new, would study his case not for what they could prove, but for what they couldn't. Because sometimes, the most dangerous man isn't the one who shouts from the rooftops. It's the one who never had to raise his voice. And as agents filed away the last reports of Dellacroce's life, they were already preparing for the storm that would follow. Gotti was rising. The cameras were coming. And the Gambino family was about to trade silence for spectacle. But in the quiet just before it all erupted, one question hung in the air, unanswered and heavy. If Aniello Dellacroce had lived just a little longer, could he have stopped it? Or was the blood already in the water? Chapter 23. The Crimes He Controlled. The door slammed shut behind him, echoing like a gavel in the back corridors of the Rave Night Social Club. A young associate, barely out of his 20s, stood shaking under the low ceiling as Aniello Dellacroce leaned forward. The man had screwed up, just a minor misstep, a missed envelope, but Dellacroce's silence was louder than any shout. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. One glance, one pause, and the kid understood. This wasn't a place for second chances. That was the weight Dellacroce carried. Not with noise, but with quiet dread. Most people thought of the Mafia as a world of flamboyance, fur coats, flashing cameras, bullet-riddled headlines. But Dellacroce ran his domain like a monastery, not a circus. His empire, vast, complex, and invisible to the naked eye, spread across New York like veins beneath the skin. You didn't see them, but they carried blood. Loan sharking, extortion, hijacking, gambling. He didn't need to bark orders or flash his power. He whispered, and men scrambled. There was a reason they called him the tall guy or the ghost. He didn't want the spotlight. He wanted control. And control, to him, came through fear wrapped in discipline. Under Dellacroce's rule, money flowed like water from a hidden spring. His grip extended to dozens of capos and their crews. Men who ran dice games in basements, took weekly payments from local bars, skimmed off the top of trucking unions. They didn't have to ask what Dellacroce wanted. They already knew. You brought the envelope on time. You kicked up your piece. You kept your mouth shut. That was the code. Every dollar earned on the street, the vig from a loan, the cut from a heist, the take from a crooked poker game, passed upward like church offerings. And Dellacroce, sitting at the heart of it all in his modest corner office, rarely left a fingerprint. His criminal portfolio was as diverse as it was low profile. He had a hand in everything, yet stayed clear of the headlines. The loan sharking alone brought in millions. To the uninitiated, it might sound like lending money with a high interest rate. But in Dellacroce's world, it was a system, a trap disguised as a lifeline. A small business owner who needed 10 grand to pay off a supplier might turn to a local wise guy. The interest rate? 2 points a week. Sounds manageable, until it isn't. A missed payment brought threats. A second missed payment brought broken bones. And if you still couldn't pay, you lost your business. Or worse, your silence. Dellacroce didn't personally break any kneecaps. He didn't have to. His soldiers did it for him, with devotion more akin to religion than crime. These weren't just tough guys. These were believers. They saw Dellacroce not as a man, but as the embodiment of old-school Cosa Nostra values. Omerta, discipline, tradition, and above all, respect. To disappoint him was to sin. To disobey him was to die. Extortion was another quiet killer in his arsenal. If you owned a business in certain parts of Queens, Manhattan, or Brooklyn during the 70s and 80s, odds were you paid someone. Not because you wanted protection, but because you understood the consequences. Dellacroce's crews didn't need to explain. A few broken windows, a delayed shipment, a car that wouldn't start in the morning. It was enough to remind you who was really in charge. He turned fear into a business model. And business was good. Then came hijacking, an art form in itself. Trucks disappeared off the roads like ghosts into the fog. 1 minute, a shipment of electronics was en route to a warehouse. The next, it vanished without a trace. Sometimes, the drivers were in on it. Sometimes, they were left tied up in alleyways. The goods would reappear days later on street corners, backroom stores, or in the trunks of cars driven by men who owed favors. Gambling, though, was the soul of Dellacroce's criminal enterprise. It was steady, constant, dependable, like an underground stock market. Dice games, numbers rackets, illegal horse betting, poker nights tucked behind pizza joints. It pulled in cash faster than any stick-up. And it didn't rely on violence to work, just trust, fear, and reputation. Dellacroce knew exactly which crews were short on their weekly take, which games were getting too hot, which cops had started sniffing around. He watched it all like a conductor. He didn't play the instruments. He didn't even lift a baton. He just gave a look, and the music played itself. But perhaps Dellacroce's greatest crime wasn't any single racket. It was the machine he built. A structure so airtight, so insulated, that it made even the FBI shake their heads. Agents later admitted they admired him in a twisted way. A true gangster, they called him. Not because he was flashy, but because he wasn't. He understood the game better than anyone. Stay quiet. Stay lethal. Stay invisible. His indirect control reached into dozens of crews, each with their own circle of enforcers, earners, and lookouts. Dellacroce never micromanaged. He didn't need to. He handpicked his capos with the same care a surgeon chooses instruments. They were men molded in his image, calculated, composed, and quietly brutal. But with every new stream of cash, every envelope of bills, every whispered order passed through smoky backrooms, something else was building beneath the surface: pressure. Some of his younger associates, emboldened by the money and the power, wanted more. They started showing off, wearing flashy suits, driving luxury cars, smiling for the camera. It was everything Dellacroce hated. He had spent decades cultivating silence, and now his protégés were lighting matches inside the church. He tried to reel them in, tried to remind them, you don't get rich in this life by being seen. You get buried. But they didn't listen. That tension between the old ways and the new noise was beginning to tear at the seams of the Gambino family. And Dellacroce felt it. He wasn't just managing rackets anymore. He was managing egos, ambition, and recklessness. The kind of recklessness that got people killed. The kind that brought heat. The kind that made bodies show up in trunks and federal agents wiretap every corner of Mulberry Street. Inside, Dellacroce was growing tired. Not physically, though his face showed the lines of a man who had spent half a century watching his back, but spiritually. He saw the foundation cracking. The thing he had built, this intricate, silent machine, was starting to make noise. And noise meant death. He started spending more time in the back office of the rave night. He spoke less, smiled even less. His words grew shorter, heavier. Some said he knew the end was coming. Not for him. For everything. For the code, the silence, the church. One night, he met privately with a young capo who had been making too much noise, flashing too much money. Dellacroce didn't threaten him, didn't shout. He just looked the man in the eye and said, "You're not ready for what comes next." Then he left. The next week, the young capo's name came up in an FBI debriefing. A wiretap had picked up his voice. Loud, bragging, sloppy. Dellacroce had known. He always knew. But no matter how hard he tried to hold back the tide, it kept rising. His crew continued to earn. The money didn't stop, but neither did the heat. Indictments, surveillance, new faces on the street, some of them wired, some of them desperate. And desperation was a dangerous currency in the underworld. Even Dellacroce's most loyal lieutenants started to feel it, the pressure to adapt, to evolve, to survive in a world that no longer respected the shadows. The balance between discipline and chaos was slipping, and in the middle of it all stood the silent monk of the Gambinos, still trying to pray in a burning chapel. That year, his name started showing up more often in FBI reports. Not because he was careless, but because the people under him were. His name was on their lips, his legacy on the line. And yet, Dellacroce never flinched. One evening, an associate who had just returned from a long prison stretch visited him. He expected Dellacroce to ask about loyalty, about who'd kept their mouths shut. Instead, Dellacroce only asked, "You still remember how to keep your eyes open?" The man nodded. "Good," Dellacroce said. "Because soon, They'll be watching all of us. As the walls began to close in around the organization, as younger men plotted and older men faded, Dellacroce remained in the eye of the storm, unshaken, unmoved. But even the eye is temporary. Eventually, the wind shifts. And when it did, Dellacroce would be forced to make a choice: stay silent and let the machine collapse under its own noise, or break the code he had lived by to save what little honor was left. But that moment hadn't come yet. Not quite. Not tonight. Chapter 24, Rave Night Revisited. The tape hissed, barely audible, but inside that hiss was the undoing of an empire. It was a cold night in December, the kind that settles into your bones and makes every street lamp glow like a ghost. Inside 247 Mulberry Street, the old Rave Night social club still breathed, though its soul had long since departed. Aniello Dellacroce had died just weeks earlier, and now his shadow lingered like incense smoke in a place that was never meant for bright lights or loud men. But Gotti was neither quiet nor shy. Where Dellacroce had worn his silence like armor, Gotti wore his charisma like a crown. He had taken the reins of the Gambino family not just with blood, but with spectacle, swaggering into the same Rave Night club, now more of a throne room than a sanctuary. Cameras followed him. Crowds waited. The FBI leaned in, ears pressed against walls they could not yet breach. The Rave Night had once been a fortress of whispers, guarded by Dellacroce discipline and distrust. But now it was a carnival of confidence. Gotti, in tailored coats and gleaming shoes, strutted in and out like a king holding court. He laughed too loud, talked too freely, and as the walls absorbed his words, someone else was listening. They called it the Rave Night bug, a tiny microphone placed deep within a floor beneath the hallway closet, a place where Gotti had foolishly believed his voice would stay private. The feds hadn't dared touch the main room. That would have been suicide. Too risky, too watched. But the hallway where Gotti took his most sensitive conversations, that was different. It was quiet, tight, and unguarded, just like Dellacroce would have preferred it. The irony was bitter. The same room that Dellacroce had used for closed-door loyalty checks and coded strategy sessions was now the very chamber that would betray his successor. Gotti never knew that each footstep across the wooden planks fed life into a listening machine buried below like a ticking time bomb. The FBI had waited, patiently, for years. They knew Gotti couldn't resist the Rave Night. It wasn't just a clubhouse anymore. It was a symbol, a monument to his rule, a lighthouse for his admirers, and a trap of his own making. It wasn't that he didn't know the risks. Gotti had grown up in a world where paranoia was taught before manners. But power breeds blindness, and Gotti had become intoxicated with his own myth. The tapes didn't lie. They didn't blink. They didn't forget. And as they spun and spooled in the darkness of a federal van down the block, the myth of the Teflon Don began to unravel one casual remark at a time. Gotti would meet regularly in that hallway, alongside Salvatore, Sammy the Bull Gravano, and Frank Lacasio. The three men spoke with the ease of those who believed they were safe. They talked about murders, about betrayals, about who should live and who should disappear. It was the kind of talk that once only lived in memory, unprovable, deniable, floating in the air like cigarette smoke. But now it was recorded, digitized, etched into the hard plastic of government evidence. The FBI had spent years chasing Gotti with traditional tools, informants, surveillance, threats. But none of it stuck. He was too slick. The public adored him. Juries feared him. Lawyers danced around him. But here, in this one piece of haunted real estate on Mulberry Street, the laws of gravity began to change. Dellacroce, even in death, seemed to hover in the background. Old-timers said that if Neil had lived, none of this would have happened. Gotti would have been checked, restrained. The Rave Night would have remained what it had always been, a chapel of secrecy. Dellacroce never allowed loose lips. He didn't even allow photographs. He scolded younger associates who talked too much or dressed too flashy. The man believed that silence wasn't just a virtue, it was a shield. And now, the shield was gone. The FBI didn't break in through the front door. They waited until Gotti was comfortable, until he felt invincible. Then, with a warrant signed in silence, They slithered in during a rare gap in surveillance. Agents disguised as utility workers snuck through a nearby storefront, drilled beneath the hallway closet, and planted the microphone in a hidden nook beneath the floorboards. The operation took months of planning, minutes of execution, and would change history. As Gotti held court upstairs, laughing, gesturing, charming anyone who entered, the floor betrayed him. With each careless word spoken over those old planks, the ghost of Dellacroce must have turned in his grave. He had built the Rave Night as a fortress of discipline. Now it was a crime scene with a slow fuse burning beneath the tiles. The tapes captured more than just words. They captured tone, swagger, arrogance. They painted a picture of a boss who believed he could never fall, surrounded by men who nodded but sometimes flinched. You could hear the loyalty in their voices, but also the fear. Gravano, once the most loyal of all, began to listen more closely than he spoke. You could hear it in the pauses, in the way his voice dropped at the mention of certain names. Seeds of doubt took root, quietly, dangerously. The FBI couldn't believe their luck. The tapes were gold. No need for turncoats, not yet. No need for wire-wearing rats. The Don was recording himself. Every session in that hallway added another brick to the government's case. They weren't just getting evidence. They were getting atmosphere, mood, proof that this wasn't a misunderstood businessman. This was a gangster running a criminal empire, casually plotting death over the hum of fluorescent lights. Still, they waited. The recordings piled up like snow on a forgotten road. The agents sat in unmarked vans with headphones pressed tight, whispering into microphones and scribbling furiously. Each tape was a gift, a crack in the armor. But they didn't move yet. They wanted more. They wanted everything. The Rave Night had become the federal government's Trojan horse, and Gotti held the reins. Sammy Gravano started to change. He had always been a killer, yes, but also a soldier, disciplined, quiet, loyal. Dellacroce had respected that about him. But as the meetings at the Rave Night grew riskier, as the tone turned from strategy to sloppiness, something inside Gravano began to twist. He could feel the danger now, not from rivals, but from within, from Gotti's mouth, from the walls themselves. One day, after another session in that cursed hallway, Gravano left the Rave Night and paused outside. He looked back, not at the door, but at the building, as if trying to see through it, as if he could feel the wires humming beneath the surface. The Rave Night had once been a place of comfort, of purpose. Now it felt like a coffin. Gotti, meanwhile, couldn't stop. He believed he was untouchable. The press loved him. The public saw him as a rogue hero. He walked past news cameras like a movie star, smirking, waving, buttoning his coat with flair. The Rave Night was his backdrop, his stage. He didn't realize it had become his trap. When the indictments came, they hit like a thunderclap. RICO charges, murder conspiracies, obstruction of justice. The tapes would speak louder than any witness. But the real betrayal was still to come. Because Gravano, broken by what he heard, what he feared, and what he knew would come next, flipped. And when he spoke, he filled in the gaps between the tapes with chilling precision. The government had the walls. Gravano had the soul. Together, they dismantled the myth of the Teflon Don, brick by brick, whisper by whisper. But before the courtroom drama, before the media storm, before the betrayal that would shake the underworld to its core, there was this. The Rave Night, standing quiet once more, emptied of men, filled only with ghosts and secrets. The bug had done its job. The hallway closet was just a closet again. But what it had heard, what it had captured, would echo through history like a confession screamed into the void. The Rave Night had always been a mirror of its master. Under Dellacroce, it was quiet, feared, and invisible. Under Gotti, it became loud, adored, and exposed. And now, it was silent again. But silence no longer meant safety. It meant the storm had already passed, and the reckoning was near. Because just beyond the courthouse walls, just past the spotlight, a prison cell was waiting. Not just for Gotti, but for everyone who believed the walls would always protect them. And somewhere, buried beneath it all, the last whispers of a dead monk still lingered. The question was, would anyone listen? Or was it already too late? Chapter 25. myth, and legacy. He died in silence. No final interview. No farewell press conference. No dramatic last stand in court. When Aniello Dellacroce slipped away in a hospital bed in late 1985, it was as if the underworld itself went quiet for a moment, mourning not just the man, but the passing of an era. But that silence didn't last long. Behind closed doors, whispers swirled. Within weeks of his death, the Gambino family would fracture, Paul Castellano would fall, and the streets would echo with gunshots instead of prayers. But even amid the chaos, one truth held firm. Aniello Dellacroce had been something rare in the Mafia. A man who didn't need headlines to wield power, who didn't crave attention, but commanded it with a stare. The kind of figure that old-timers still talk about in hushed, reverent tones. His legend didn't come from flamboyance or body counts. It came from the way he carried himself, like a ghost in the dark corners of the underworld, moving with purpose, speaking only when necessary. He wasn't called the silent monk as a joke. He earned it. In a world where everyone was screaming to be seen, Dellacroce kept his mouth shut and his hands steady. And that quiet became his roar. To understand Dellacroce's legacy, you have to understand the fear he inspired, not because of wild violence, but because of what he represented. Discipline, loyalty, control. He was the last line between tradition and chaos. The kind of man who could kill without emotion, but also cry at his daughter's funeral. He lived in the shadows, but he wasn't hollow. There was a storm inside him, carefully caged. And everyone knew, if that cage ever broke open, there'd be hell to pay. Mobsters who came up under him still speak his name with a kind of religious awe. One soldier once said that when Dellacroce walked into a room, the air changed. It was like something holy just entered, he recalled. You didn't talk. You listened. You shut the F*** up. That reverence wasn't just about fear, it was about respect. Dellacroce never wore flashy suits. He didn't run around with starlets or snort cocaine in nightclubs. His life was ritual. Wake early. Observe. Command. Protect. Punish. He didn't live like a king. He lived like a monk with a pistol. But make no mistake, his hands were stained with blood. In the 1960s and 70s, Dellacroce was allegedly behind dozens of murders. He never spoke about them, never bragged, never slipped up, but everyone knew. He saw violence not as sport, but as duty. If you betrayed the code, you disappeared. No negotiation, no warning, just the end. And yet, somehow, that cold precision gave him a strange kind of purity in the eyes of traditionalists. To them, he wasn't a killer. He was a guardian, of honor, of silence, of the old ways. In their minds, he wasn't a criminal. He was a priest in a corrupt church. As the years went on, his myth only grew, especially after his death. Older wise guys would tell stories about how Dellacroce had the power to calm feuds with a glance, how even the bosses of rival families lowered their eyes when he entered a room. Whether all of it was true didn't really matter. Legends aren't measured by facts. They're measured by fear, respect, and how long people remember your name. What Dellacroce left behind wasn't just a body. It was a vacuum. When he died, the fragile bridge between Paul Castellano and John Gotti collapsed. Dellacroce had kept the family from tearing itself apart, holding both egos in check. Once he was gone, there was no one left to stop the war that had been simmering just beneath the surface. The assassination of Castellano, staged weeks after Dellacroce's funeral, was not just a coup. It was a eulogy to a forgotten code. Gotti didn't just kill a boss. He buried the old Mafia, the kind Dellacroce had tried to preserve. Silent, disciplined, invisible. And that's where the myth takes on even more weight. Because some believe that if Dellacroce had lived just a few months longer, everything might have been different. The family might have stayed united. The media might have never fixated on Gotti's swagger. The FBI might have stayed blind a little longer. There are those who think Dellacroce could have stopped the storm, but others say no, that the cancer in the organization had already spread too far, that even Dellacroce, with all his influence, couldn't hold back the tide, that his death wasn't the cause of the collapse. It was just the last brick falling from a crumbling wall. Still, It's telling that both sides in that debate point to the same man as the linchpin. He was the gravity holding the Gambino family in orbit. Without him, they spun out of control. For the FBI, Dellacroce remained a mystery to the end. Agents respected him in the way one might respect a skilled adversary. He never got sloppy, never made waves. He kept his circle small and his mouth sealed. One veteran agent said Dellacroce was the most disciplined gangster I ever tracked. He didn't blink. In thousands of hours of surveillance tapes, Dellacroce barely appears. He was the opposite of Gotti, who strutted into the camera's eye. Dellacroce slipped around it. If the Mafia were a poker table, he was the guy who folded every hand, until he went all in and walked away with the pot. Even inside law enforcement, there was a strange admiration, not for what he did, but for how he did it. With control, with consistency, with silence. But myths aren't built on silence alone. They're built on moments. And there were flashes in Dellacroce's life, rare, revealing flickers, when you could see the man beneath the mask. Like the time he refused to betray his men under federal pressure, even when offered a deal to walk free. Or the way he treated his subordinates, many of whom called him a father. Or the quiet grief he carried after his daughter's death, a pain that softened his hard eyes, if only for a while. These moments didn't make the headlines, but they made the man. There's irony in Dellacroce's legacy. He spent his life avoiding the spotlight, only to become a legend after death. He never wanted fame, but found it in whispers and street corner tales. He tried to hold the line, and in doing so, became the line between the old world and the new, between order and chaos. And that legend still breathes in dark corners of Brooklyn bars, in whispered conversations between aging soldiers who shake their heads at the mess the mob has become. They'll say things like, Dellacroce wouldn't have allowed this, or Neil would have handled it different. His name still carries weight, not just because of what he did, but because of what he didn't do. He didn't sell out, didn't make a show, didn't run. He faced prison, death, betrayal, all without flinching. In a world built on treachery, that kind of constancy becomes a myth of its own. But myths are tricky things. They inspire, they haunt, they distort. And as new generations of wise guys rise, they inherit the story, but not the substance. They remember the name, but forget the code. They want the fear Dellacroce commanded, but without earning it. And so the image remains, but the soul is lost. That's the final tragedy of Aniello Dellacroce, that his legacy may outlive his lessons. As the years pass, his grave in Queens sees fewer visitors. The soldiers he once mentored are either dead, imprisoned, or lost to time. The family he held together has fractured again and again. And yet, his story persists. Because every time the Mafia falters, someone looks back and asks, what would Neil have done? And for a moment, the myth breathes again. But myths don't protect you forever. As the documentary closes, a grainy photo of Dellacroce lingers on the screen. Stoic, unreadable, eternal. The narrator's voice dips lower, almost a whisper. And just as the music swells, a question cuts through the silence like a knife. What happens when the myth begins to fade? Chapter 26. End of an era. The world was changing, and the Mafia didn't see it coming. In the winter of 1985, inside a dimly lit hospital room tucked away from the noise of the streets, Aniello Dellacroce, the last of a dying breed, was dying in silence. Outside, the city pulsed with cold wind and headlines. Inside, the man who had once held the Gambino family together with nothing more than his word and stare now lay weak, his body eaten away by cancer, his breath shallow, his grip on life fading like the last embers in a fireplace no one tended anymore. No soldiers stood guard at his bedside. There were no grand farewells. Just silence. The same silence that Dellacroce had worn like armor throughout his life now cloaked him in death. For decades, he had been the underworld's invisible spine, holding up an empire with loyalty, discipline, and a bone-deep understanding of what the life truly demanded. But now, the men outside were growing louder, flashier, and far less careful. When news of his death rippled through the Mafia's inner circles, it struck with a strange numbness. It wasn't just grief, it was something deeper, something that told the old-timers in their bones. Everything was about to change. Dellacroce was the last bridge between the old code and the new hunger. And with his death, that bridge collapsed. He died on November 2nd, 1985, but it wasn't just a man that passed, it was a way of life. For half a century, Dellacroce had operated in the shadows, his power quiet but immense. He'd kept Gotti and his restless crew in check, whispered warnings, enforced boundaries, and above all, protected the family from its own ambition. But now, the leash was gone. Gotti heard the news in Queens. He was already pacing toward a decision he knew would either crown him king or bury him. For years, he'd felt Castellano had no heart for the streets, no love for the soldiers, no respect for the rituals Dellacroce held sacred. With Dellacroce alive, Gotti had waited. Out of loyalty, out of fear, out of some ancient Mafia calculus that said you don't move without the silent man's blessing. But Dellacroce was gone now, and that silence? It no longer protected anyone. The funeral was quiet, almost eerily so. No fanfare, no brass, just a few black coats in the rain, heads bowed, faces lined with the kind of sorrow that doesn't cry. It simply sinks. Federal agents watched from cars parked down the block, their notebooks ready. But there was nothing to see, nothing to hear. No elaborate eulogy, no vows of revenge or glory. Just a whisper among wise guys. Now it begins. In the days that followed, something shifted. It was subtle at first. Meetings once held behind restaurant kitchens now moved into social clubs with glass fronts. Soldiers who used to walk the block in leather gloves and low voices began showing up in suits that screamed money. Gotti began making calls, quiet ones, but strategic. Men were summoned, old alliances tested, and all of it happening under the ghostly weight of Dellacroce's absence. He had been the pressure valve, the monk who knew when to pray and when to kill, who knew that the Mafia only survived when its blood ran beneath the surface, not splattered across the headlines. Dellacroce had taught restraint not through speeches, but by example. He never flaunted power. He embodied it. He was the kind of man who could terrify with a look and calm a room with a whisper. But now, his example was a memory. And Gotti, impatient, charismatic, hungry, was no longer interested in restraint. The FBI felt it too. They called it a power vacuum. But what they really meant was, the wolves were loose. And they were right. Because within 6 weeks of Dellacroce's death, Paul Castellano, the man who'd sat on the throne of the Gambino family, would lie dead on the sidewalk outside Sparks Steakhouse, riddled with bullets, his body twitching beneath Christmas lights. The old order shattered in an instant. But the hit didn't come out of nowhere. It had been brewing like a storm behind thick clouds. Dellacroce had spent years holding that storm back. With nods, with warnings, with long silences in back rooms that made even the toughest guys rethink their plans. He had been a firewall between impulse and execution. And when that firewall died, everything caught fire. There's a certain irony in how he died. A man who'd escaped every trap, every bug, every betrayal, felled not by a bullet, but by cancer. His greatest enemy had no face, no wire, no badge. Just time. And when it finally caught up to him, it left behind a void the Mafia couldn't fill. Not with loyalty, not with fear, not even with blood. Some men whispered that Dellacroce wouldn't have allowed the Castellano hit, that he would have called Gotti in, stared him down, and said the one word that ended arguments. No. And maybe that would have been enough. Maybe Castellano would still be alive. Maybe Gotti would have waited. Maybe the family wouldn't have plunged headfirst into the spotlight. Maybe. But there are no maybes in the life. Only decisions. And consequences. What Dellacroce represented, what made him so feared and revered, wasn't just his ability to do violence. It was his ability to withhold it. To understand that real power wasn't in who you killed, but in who you let live. He was old school in the purest sense. Not because of tradition, but because he knew the street was a place of balance. And once that balance tipped, everything fell. And fall it did. After his death, the FBI watched as the Gambino family turned from a silent fortress into a neon-lit parade. Gotti began appearing in newspapers. On TV, outside courtrooms, flashing smiles like a movie star. Reporters dubbed him the Dapper Don. The public fell in love. But inside the world Dellacroce had left behind, the whispers grew darker. Respect turned into resentment. Power turned into spectacle. And the old rules? Forgotten. In their surveillance logs, agents wrote that Dellacroce had been the last real gangster. The kind you couldn't wiretap, couldn't flip, couldn't catch doing anything, because he didn't do anything you could see. He was smoke in a dark room, a threat you didn't hear until it was too late. That kind of man doesn't leave behind blueprints, only shadows. And yet, his absence was louder than any of his words. The FBI didn't celebrate his death. In private, some even admitted they missed him, because Dellacroce was predictable in his discipline. You could chart the family's movements by his silences. You could sense the limits by what he didn't allow. But now, there were no limits. Just ambition. Gotti's rise was swift, but so was the heat. Indictments, bugs, betrayals. The very things Dellacroce had worked his whole life to avoid now became the daily headlines. The family, once a ghost in the machine, was now a target in full view. And it all led back to that moment, when the silent monk of the Gambinos closed his eyes for the last time. They buried him without gold, without headlines, without the applause Gotti would later receive. But his legacy lingered in every backroom where the old-timers still whispered about how things used to be. In every soldier who looked over his shoulder and wondered if maybe, just maybe, it had all gone too far. Some said Dellacroce's death marked the end of La Cosa Nostra. Not literally, but spiritually. Because without him, there was no one left to remind them why the life had rules in the first place. No one left to walk into a room and lower voices with a glance. No one left to say enough. He wasn't perfect. He had blood on his hands, secrets in his eyes, and a ledger only the dead could read. But he understood something Gotti never did. Some ghosts are more powerful than kings. And now, as the cameras turned toward Gotti's grin and the prosecutors loaded up case after case, the silent weight of Dellacroce's absence grew louder with every headline. In the end, the man who'd kept the Mafia quiet was gone, and the noise would never stop again. But beneath all the noise, in the low hum of fear that still lived in back alleys and prison walls, his name remained. Unspoken, untouchable, not out of reverence, but out of fear that saying it might bring him back. Because some men don't need to be seen to be remembered. And just as the streets forgot how to stay silent, a black car pulled into a quiet lot in Brooklyn, headlights off, engine ticking. A young capo stepped out, eyes scanning the dark. He was there to deliver a message. Not for Gotti, not for the feds, but for a ghost. Chapter 27, The Final Judgment. The priest found him alone in the hospital room. A small crucifix hung crookedly above the bed, casting a faint shadow on the pale wall behind him. Aniello Dellacroce lay motionless, not because of the cancer that was eating away at his insides, but because of something deeper, something heavy pressing against his soul. The silent monk of the Gambinos, once the most feared man in the room no matter where he stood, was now just a name whispered in sterile hallways and watched by silent guards. He had no visitors that day, no capos, no underbosses, not even Gotti, the man he had lifted from the street into the throne room of the Mafia. The nurse said he hadn't spoken in days. But when the priest leaned close, offering last rites, Dellacroce turned his head slightly, just enough to make it clear he wasn't afraid to die. Not even a flicker of fear behind those deep, hollow eyes. Outside the hospital, the world was changing. The mob was no longer hiding in the shadows. It was in the tabloids, on television, splashed across headlines. Gotti had made sure of that. But Dellacroce had always resisted the pull of the spotlight. He believed in omerta, not magazine covers. In his eyes, the more the world watched you, the closer it crept with a knife in its hand. In the final days of his life, as the morphine dulled the pain, old memories returned with a sharpness that cut through the haze. He saw the faces of the men he'd buried, the blood that had stained his hands, the orders he'd given without blinking. But he also saw the loyalty, the code, the strange kind of honor that lived in that world. For Dellacroce, The Mafia wasn't just business. It was a sacred oath. It was war, yes, but it was also family. And in his eyes, family came before ambition. That's what made him different. Back in the 60s, he'd sat across the table from Carlo Gambino, nodding quietly as Carlo spoke. He rarely spoke first. When he did, it was always brief, never more than what needed to be said. That was Dellacroce's way. Quiet, controlled, terrifying in his silence. Even his enemies feared that silence more than bullets. Because when Dellacroce didn't say anything, it meant he had already decided. But silence didn't mean peace. Inside him, a storm had always been brewing. He was capable of savage violence. Men who betrayed him didn't get warnings, they vanished. If he had a point to make, he made it with blood. And yet, he had rules. He didn't touch women or children. He didn't make threats he couldn't back up. There was a line in the sand, and Dellacroce never crossed it unless someone else did first. He came from the old world. The church, the code, a rosary in one hand and a gun in the other. That's what made him a paradox. Someone who could kneel in prayer and then order a murder 10 minutes later. He was nicknamed Father O'Neill for a reason. He dressed in black, rarely smiled, and lived like a monk. Even in his mansion on Staten Island, his life was modest. No gold rings, no flashy suits. His power came not from noise, but from presence. And that presence haunted people. Agents who tailed him said he had a ghost-like quality. He never used the phone. He spoke in code. He never reacted emotionally. The feds called him unbreakable. One agent even said, Dellacroce doesn't sweat. He absorbs. They couldn't pin anything on him, not for decades. He moved in whispers, in gestures, in glances, like a shadow that never cast one. But that style, the old-school way, was crumbling. In his final year, Dellacroce watched his kingdom slip through his fingers. The split between the Gotti crew and the Castellano regime was growing toxic. Meetings were being skipped. Messages ignored. Paul Castellano ruled from a distance, detached, corporate. Gotti ruled from the street, hungry, angry. Dellacroce was stuck in the middle, a dying patriarch holding a family that no longer wanted to be held. If he had lived just a few weeks longer, maybe the hit on Castellano never would have happened. Maybe he could have calmed Gotti, reminded him that revenge is a dish best served cold, not in front of cameras and Christmas shoppers. But fate didn't give him that chance. And some say Gotti waited for that. That he knew Dellacroce would never allow such betrayal, no matter how much he disliked Paul. As Dellacroce's organs began to fail, the streets buzzed with anticipation. Everyone knew what was coming. A power shift. A war. A crown without a king. The old man's death was the starting gun. In his final hours, no confession came. No regrets. Just that same distant look in his eyes, like he was already somewhere else. Maybe in the past, walking through the shadows of Mulberry Street. Maybe standing beside Gambino one last time. Maybe watching the future burn from a safe distance. And yet, behind that cold exterior, there was something else, grief. The kind that doesn't show up in tears but settles in the bones. He had watched his world fade, one brick at a time. The honor, the order, the unspoken rules, all being replaced by ego, greed, and flashbulbs. He saw what was coming, and he didn't like it. When the monitors flatlined, the news didn't break until the next morning. Even in death, he slipped away quietly. There was no funeral procession, no televised tributes, just a few men in dark suits, standing over a closed casket, remembering the last gangster who truly lived by the code. But the real judgment came later, not from God, not from the feds, but from history. Was Aniello Dellacroce a monster? A man who helped build an empire on blood, extortion, and fear? Or was he a keeper of a dying code, a guardian of discipline in a world spinning out of control? It depends on who you ask. To some, he was a cold-blooded killer. To others, a philosopher with a pistol. Either way, he was never ordinary. There was a story whispered around social clubs after his death, that when a young associate asked him once why he never smiled, Dellacroce replied, "Because this life takes everything from you, and then it asks for more." Maybe that was his real curse. He gave everything to the life, and in return, it took his family, his peace, and eventually, his legacy. Because when Gotti stepped into the spotlight, the image of the Mafia changed forever. Out went the silence, in came the swagger. Out went the loyalty, in came the limelight. And Dellacroce's way, the quiet, brutal, disciplined way, was buried with him. Even the FBI felt his absence. Agents admitted later that while they hated what he represented, they respected him, because he played by the old rules. He didn't beg. He didn't talk. He didn't run. And in the end, he died like he lived, stoic, silent, and in control. But some say he haunts the halls of the Gambino family to this day, not as a ghost, but as a warning, a reminder of what once was, of the balance that was lost, and of the price that comes with power unchecked. A few years after his death, Gotti would stand in court, the cameras flashing, the world watching. A king crowned in chaos. But behind him, in the silence, was Dellacroce's shadow. Always watching, always judging. And maybe that's the final twist in Dellacroce's story. That even in death, his silence still speaks louder than all the noise that followed. But there's one thing no one ever figured out. Not the FBI, not the mob, not even the men closest to him. Who was Aniello Dellacroce really? The man? The myth? The monk? The monster? Or maybe something more? That question never got an answer. And maybe it never will.